We all know that World War I was one of the deadliest in history, although it would be beaten out by a sequel that no one asked for. From incompetent generals to terrifying trenches, life as a World War I soldier was never easy. But who really had it the worst on the battlefield and why? In this video, we'll take a look at 5 major World War I armies. Join us as we discuss what made them so terrible and decide which army would have truly been the worst to fight for. Great Britain entered World War I with a small force of highly trained soldiers. Tasked with holding a tiny slice of the Western Front, this capable army did their job well at first. Like all good things, the British Expeditionary Force, also known as the Old Contemptibles, did not last. Heavy casualties eventually decimated the Old Contemptibles. They were replaced with the large yet inexperienced Kitchener's army. With no seasoned commanders to guide them, Kitchener's army went through a devastating learning curve on the front lines. Inexperience and a shortage of quality munitions eventually led to the disastrous Battle of the Somme. At the Somme, UK soldiers bombarded German forces for a week. When the artillery fire ceased, British soldiers marched across no man's land, not realizing that their earlier attack had been completely ineffective. Incompetent and inexperienced leaders aside, UK soldiers dealt with other problems. Ever-present supply issues, harsh trench conditions, and a cobbled-together army were just a few issues they faced that made the war even more difficult. Add to that fact that the top military brass in the UK had a twisted notion of honour, and serving in the British Armed Forces became even more hellish. For example, the unofficial reason, as per the Air Board, as to why British pilots didn't have parachutes was because the presence of such an apparatus might impair the fighting spirit of pilots and cause them to abandon machines which might otherwise be capable of returning to base for repair. By 1914, France was a well-recognized power in the Western world and was ready to face its old rival, Germany. And the French did get off to a good start, with heavy patriotism running rampant across the country. This, and mandatory service laws, helped swell the ranks of the French reserves. Then, it all went downhill. For the duration of the war, commanders operated under a cult of the offensive mentality. This strategy can be boiled down to hit them first, hit them hard, and keep hitting them until you win. Unfortunately, this strategy proved to be a bad one. Take the events at Audregny as an example. Here, 2 mounted cavalry regiments, the 9th Lancers and the 4th Dragoon Guards, charged across an open field. On the other side, hundreds of German machine guns, rifles, and artillery pieces. And we can't forget Robert Nivelle and the Second Battle of Aisne. Convinced that he would win the war in a single battle by throwing men at the enemy, Nivelle instead ended up sending thousands of men to their deaths. This maneuver was the straw that broke the camel's back. Morale began to plummet. Riots, protests, and mutinies broke out on the Western Front and at home. French leaders arrested hundreds of French soldiers for mutiny and later executed dozens of them as a warning to the rest of their soldiers. In fact, France held the somber title of having shot the highest number of its own soldiers throughout the war, with at least 918 men executed, which placed it far ahead of Germany and the other World War I participant countries according to official figures. The French army was stuck in the past, stuck in a cult of the offensive mentality, and stuck with leaders too willing to use their men as cannon fodder. Russia boasted the largest army in World War I, with forces already 5 million strong at the start of the war. With all those troops marching out to conquer the Eastern Front, surely the Russian army would score some victories. Right? Wrong. Large numbers actually turned out to be one of Russia's biggest weaknesses. Overestimating its military ability and its railroad supply chain, the Russian army struggled to deploy all its men. So sure, the Tsar could raise a huge army, but that doesn't matter much if it isn't functional. With so many soldiers to supply, it's no surprise that one of Russia's main problems was a lack of, well, everything. As a soldier in this army, you would likely have marched out to war without boots, a rifle, or a gas mask. It was up to you to scavenge the necessary supplies from fallen enemies or fallen friends. and the problem of ill-equipped soldiers was only compounded by another serious shortage, that of medical staff. The Russian army had only about one surgeon for every 10,000 men. That means that your chances of getting some medical attention if you were wounded or ill were next to none. Imagine you're an unprepared and untrained Russian soldier, hungry and disillusioned with what seems to be a pointless fight. Now throw in plenty of bad military maneuvers, add a few useless commanders, round it out with some huge losses like the Battle of Tannenberg, where more than 30,000 Russian troops lost their lives. That's what it might have been like to be a soldier in the Tsar's army. It comes as no surprise that the weary Russians later took the fight to what they saw as the true source of their problems, their own government. While about to become notorious for its approach to warfare, the German Empire was young, not even 50 years old at the start of World War I. At the time, Germany was a collection of smaller states, still getting the hang of working as a cohesive unit. That's what made it so surprising when the German army functioned so well, at least for a time. German military leaders were doing some great things, elastic defense and coherent communication to name a few. Also important, especially on the Western Front, German trenches were more sophisticated than the holes the British were using. In fact, some even sported homey features such as electricity, toilets, and roomy reinforced accommodations. So, where did they go wrong? It all started with some hopeful thinking. Concerned that they wouldn't win a war on two fronts, Germany's plan was to neutralize France and then focus on Russia. Not a bad idea, right? Wrong. At the First Battle of the Marne, a little miscommunication between German generals and some quick thinking from the British and French forced the Germans to make a quick retreat. The result of that retreat was disastrous. Soldiers weren't the only ones upset by this poor showing. General von Moltke, a top general in the German Empire, reportedly admitted to the Kaiser that the army had lost the war. Even more telling, the general also confided in his wife following the battle, writing to her that things have not gone well. These prominent losses had serious consequences. Morale on the Western Front was understandably low, and soldiers in the eastern flanks weren't much happier. Add supply shortages caused by the collapse of the German economy, and things didn't look good for Deutschland's soldiers. Finally, let's take a look at the Austro-Hungarian army. While they started off as one of the most notable European powers, Austria-Hungary didn't fare too well on the battlefield, suffering debilitating defeats from the very beginning of the war. Originally, Austria-Hungary only saw itself fighting on one front. By the end of the war though, they were resisting not only Russia, but also the UK and Italy. Fighting on three fronts is hard enough for a cohesive and well-trained army, and unfortunately, the Austro-Hungarian forces were neither of those things. The Austro-Hungarian army was made up of a patchwork of ethnicities, each with its own language. This made effective training, fighting, and commanding near impossible. Think fighting in World War I couldn't get any worse? Try being part of an army where your superiors might accuse you of betrayal or cowardice or blame you for military losses, just based on your ethnicity. Austria-Hungary also entered the war with a smaller force than any of the other major players. And by December 1914, more than half of their forces were gone, victim to enemy fire, starvation, exposure, and disease. And of course, you have to add to that all the usual problems afflicting World War I armies: incompetent commanders, limited supplies, and ill planning. Attacked from within and from without, is it any wonder that the Austro-Hungarian army fared so badly? So, which major World War I army was the worst to fight in? Going by the numbers, and our own opinion, Austro-Hungarian soldiers likely had it the worst overall. The cards were stacked against them thanks to the size and makeup of their army, as well as the lack of training and preparation. Austria-Hungary also suffered some of the most debilitating defeats of World War I, even with the help of its German allies. Of course, numbers don't tell the whole story here. Every army discussed above faced its own unique and not so unique challenges. War and tragedy go hand in hand. It's always been this way. From ancient times through the classic ages, across the medieval period and right up to the 19th century, battlefields were sites of carnage, of unspeakable slaughter. Soldiers killed in their ranks, prisoners executed when they could have been spared, civilians caught up in the wrong place at the wrong time, with nowhere else to go. The First World War was no different. A war on this scale was always going to result in senseless death and suffering wherever it was fought. But something had changed: the nature of the weaponry. While in centuries before, warriors had charged with swords and spears or advanced against musket volleys, the battlefields of World War I were raked with machine gun fire, rigged with barbed wire and landmines, poisoned by gas, and racked with explosions never before seen in the world. This was a product of the Industrial Revolution, and new tactics were required to keep men alive. But this need went unanswered by some of the veteran generals in command. For many of these generals, the First World War would be an exercise in incompetence, callous cruelty, and unyielding inflexibility. Rather than adapting to new modes and methods, these commanders contributed to the slaughter, either intentionally or unintentionally. In this two-part video, we're looking at some of the worst offenders, the most brutal and incompetent generals from each of the major fighting forces of World War I, and we're starting with the British Army. Lions led by donkeys. This is a phrase that often comes to mind when we think of the British Army in the First World War. Who coined this phrase, and when? Similar quotes can be traced back to the Crimean War and even to Arabic and Greek scholars of the medieval and classical periods is up for debate, but most of us know exactly what this means. The lions were of course the British soldiers, charging into no man's land bound for glory or death. The donkeys are their generals, incompetent, out of their depth, not bothered by the slaughter of men they considered their social inferiors. It's now more than a century since the guns fell silent in November 1918, and yet there's one name that is still synonymous with this famous metaphor: the name of Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. Born in Edinburgh in 1861, the first Earl Haig was the most famous and the most senior of the British generals. As the Commander-in-Chief of British forces in France for the majority of the war, he was directly responsible for many of the tactical decisions made by the British during the conflict, including the strategy that characterized the Western Front in the modern British consciousness: the strategy of attrition. Haig was quite clear about his aims. The British army simply had to kill more than the Germans did, inflicting heavier losses on the enemy while sustaining fewer casualties. In a way, Haig was true to his word. British casualties at the Battle of the Somme in 1916 were around 420,000. Germans, on the other hand, suffered at least 440,000 casualties. The forces of attrition had just about prevailed. But this was a battle lasting 140 days, resulting in over 1 million casualties once the French losses were added to the British and German totals, with only meagre territorial gains as a result. By November 1916, when the Battle of Ancre signaled the final major offensive on the Somme that year, neither side had gained any real tactical advantage. The British may have lost fewer men than the Germans, but those losses had achieved almost nothing. No day represents the bloody waste of life on the Somme better than the 1st of July, 1916. This was the day Field Marshal Haig's big plan would be executed. 13 British divisions, along with 6 French, advancing at a steady pace across no man's land, with each soldier carrying 30 kilos worth of kit. Ahead of them was a creeping bombardment, which would, Haig was sure, liquidate the German positions, leaving the Entente troops free to walk into the shattered enemy trenches and establish a new line. Except, Haig was wrong. The barrage drove the Germans underground, but they were back at their guns before the British and French troops had crossed the open space of no man's land. What the Germans saw was a wall of men walking slowly in uniform lines toward them, barely able to believe their luck. they opened fire, and the advancing soldiers were cut down in their hundreds. Almost 20,000 men lost their lives on that ill-fated advance, the single most catastrophic day in the history of the British Army. It was only the first major action on the Somme. Some have argued that the butcher reputation is unfair to Haig. This was an unprecedented struggle, fought on an unprecedented scale, and with technology that was far, far ahead of the military tactics of the day. And Haig did, at least outwardly, appear to learn a lesson from the slaughter on the banks of the Somme. The following year, at the village of Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, Haig was in command once again, and he pledged not to commit British forces to the same heavy losses inflicted in 1916. He spoke the truth, in a sense. Units under British command suffered only 275,000 casualties this time. This time, the Entente powers gained some ground, but all of this was abandoned in the face of the counterattack by the Germans in 1918. More than 250,000 killed, missing, or wounded, and for nothing more than a small short-term gain. Haig may have been up against serious challenges at the head of the British forces in France during World War I, but his tactical blunders cost hundreds of thousands of lives in attacks that would ultimately be futile. As war erupted to the northwest and northeast, Italy found herself in a compromised position. A member of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary since 1882, Italy was nominally an enemy of the Triple Entente, namely Britain, France, and Russia. However, the situation was a bit more complex than this. Colonial actions in Libya led to disharmony between Italy and the Ottoman Empire, an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary from 1914. What's more, imperial commanders in Vienna had spoken of a strike against Italy for a number of years. The Triple Alliance, now more than 3 decades old, was falling apart. And yet, Italy still had no compelling diplomatic reason to get involved on either side. Instead, the pressure came from within. Italy, a new country made up of a network of states and kingdoms with a fractious history, needed a galvanizing struggle that her people could rally around. If this struggle brought territorial gains, like those along the border with Austria-Hungary in modern-day Slovenia, then so much the better. Enter Luigi Cardona. As Italy joined the war on the side of the Triple Entente in 1915, she needed armed forces that were up to the job. Cardona, appointed Italy's Chief of General Staff in 1914, was tasked with organizing these forces, which turned out to be far from easy. Large numbers of men and large amounts of equipment were still in Libya, and even with these assets, the Italian forces struggled to match up to their Austro-Hungarian adversaries to the northeast. With his country now fully engaged in the struggle, Luigi Cardona became synonymous with hard-fought victories that cost Italy dear. Under Cardona's control, Italian forces contained an Austrian attack on Trentino in the spring of 1916, captured the fortress at Gorizia in modern-day Slovenia later that year, and took the Bajincica plateau the following year. In each case, casualties were high and discipline was strict. Unconfirmed allegations suggest that Cardona's officers utilized the Roman disciplinary tactic of decimation, murdering 1 in every 10 men from units that did not perform. While these rumors have not been proven, it's certain that Cardona personally approved the executions of over 1,000 Italian troops during the war. And yet, in spite of all this, Italy was proving no pushover. You may have heard of the battles at the Gorizia fortress and the Bajincica plateau by other names. These two actions form part of the broader Isonzo front, a series of engagements that took place over 2 years. The Gorizia fortress was the 7th battle of the Isonzo. The Bajincica plateau was the 11th. But it would be the 12th battle of Isonzo, the Battle of Caporetto, that would forever color the reputation of Luigi Cardona. By October 27, 1917, the Italian forces on the Isonzo were exhausted. Tired of the death and destruction that had rained down on them since the summer of 1915, and of small victories accompanied by massive losses, the realities of war were taking their toll on the troops. Perhaps understanding this, or maybe just launching another assault in the seesaw of conflict that tipped back and forth across the rugged valley, the Austrian columns attacked. An artillery bombardment smashed into the Italian positions, followed by an enormous wave of Austrian infantry. The Italians had had enough. Those who weren't slain where they stood threw down their arms and attempted a desperate retreat. Those familiar with Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms may know a little bit about the chaos of this retreat. Some units fought on as they withdrew, while others fled in panic. Officers, desperate to retain a semblance of order, executed dissenters and deserters by the roadside as the Italians were pushed back almost 100 miles to the Piave River. The 12 battles of Isonzo cost 950,180 Italian casualties and brought down the Italian government. By the close of the war, Cadorna's rigid tactics and disregard for human life saw Italian military manpower reduced by 2/3. Caporetto remains the greatest defeat in Italian history, and the word has become synonymous with failure and humiliation in Italy ever since. Cadorna, the architect who oversaw the disaster, faced an official inquiry over his actions during the war, but escaped any repercussions. He was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal in 1924. Since a coup d'etat overthrew the Ottoman government at the beginning of 1913, the empire had been ruled by the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP. The figureheads of the CUP were Ismail Enver, Mehmed Talat, and Ahmed Shemal. Together, they were known as the Three Pashas, the nominal rulers of a land that stretched from the Black Sea down most of the length of the Arabian Peninsula. The Ottoman Empire is one of the greatest the world has ever seen, but by the time war was declared in 1914, it was a shadow of its former self. A costly and disastrous action in the Balkan states had seen Istanbul lose most of its European territories, while Libya had fallen to the Italians in 1912, effectively ending Ottoman control in North Africa. An empire in its twilight years, reeling from a lackluster campaign in the Balkans, the Ottomans needed to redeem themselves in World War I, but on which side? Ahmed Cemal Pasha had favoured an alliance with France and was wary of Germany. The idea of fighting on the same side as Austria-Hungary may not have been a pleasant one either, as this empire now controlled former Ottoman territories in Yugoslavia. Still, on October 29, 1914, an Ottoman fleet orchestrated by the German Admiral Wilhelm Saturn launched an assault on the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. Each side blamed the other, but the result was the same. The Ottoman Empire was now in the war, on the side of the Central Powers. Ahmed Cemal Pasha got to work. Nominated as the commander of Ottoman forces against the British Army in Egypt, Cemal became governor of Syria in 1915, launching 2 operations from the province that targeted the Suez Canal. The operations failed, with significant loss of life for Syrian and other Arab soldiers within the Ottoman armies. The arrival of the British Mesopotamian Expeditionary Force opened up another Middle Eastern front, and Cemal's forces scored a significant victory on the outskirts of Baghdad, driving the British divisions back from Ctesiphon to Kut al-Amara, where they were surrounded, besieged, and roundly defeated. Cemal refused to permit the British to evacuate their wounded, an example of the contempt Cemal held for his enemy. When the local Arab population revolted in 1916, Cemal took another opportunity to demonstrate the callous cruelty he reserved for opponents, hanging dozens of Lebanese and Syrian Arabs and earning the Arabic name Al-Safa, Bloodshedder. Despite his iron fist ruling style and his victory over the British at Kut, the war in Mesopotamia did not go well for Cemal. His forces suffered defeat after defeat, pursued back across the Iraqi deserts as Allied forces retook Kut and seized Baghdad. In a reorganization of the Ottoman forces, Cemal was demoted, serving as commander of the 4th Army, but answering to the German general Erich von Falkenhayn. The defeats continued. Most of Palestine had fallen to British control by November 1917, and Cemal was recalled to Istanbul the following June, before returning to Syria in August to mount a defense against the British advance. In the end, it was less of a defense and more of an expression of rage. As British forces closed in, Jamal Pasha's troops murdered around 250 Arab civilians at Tafaz, including, according to T.E. Lawrence, pregnant women. Jamal Pasha's story is one of military incompetence coupled with extreme cruelty. Along with the massacres at Tafaz and following the Arab revolt, Jamal was directly involved in the expulsion of more than 6,000 Jews from Jaffa in 1914 and more than 10,000 Jews, Christians and Muslims from the port city in 1917. Jamal was also the architect of policies that enabled the Armenian genocides. Jamal's actual role in these genocides is not clear. He may have saved the lives of some Armenians within Ottoman borders, but he certainly assisted in the extermination of many others. He would use the genocides as a bargaining chip with the Entente powers, boasting that he could end the killing in exchange for the promise that the empire's pre-1914 territory would be respected. The promise came to nothing, and Jamal's cruelty and callousness would not be forgotten. After the war, Jamal was sentenced to death for the massacres of Arabs in Syria, although not for the killings of Armenians. It didn't matter anyway, as Jamal had fled, hiding out in Europe before heading to Afghanistan, where he worked as a senior military advisor to the country's new Royal Army. Seeking to expand his role in Afghanistan, Jamal headed to Tbilisi to broker a potential partnership with the new Soviet Union. It was here that his crimes would catch up with him. On July 21st, 1922, Jamal was assassinated by members of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, eager to avenge the murder of their fellow citizens. General Maximilian von Prittwitz's World War I career is a remarkably short one. On August 2nd, 1914, war was declared in Europe, and von Prittwitz was assigned to defend East Prussia from Russian invasion. At Gumbinnen, von Prittwitz had a simple brief. He was to hold his line, stand up and resist the Russian advance moving into East Prussia. Answering him in the chain of command were the generals at the head of each corps: Hermann von Francois of the 1st Corps, August von Mackensen of the 17th, Friedrich von Scholz of the 20th, and Otto von Bellow of the 1st Reserve. The Russian force was bigger than the German one, but it was overstretched and suffering from exhaustion. General Francois's scouts identified vulnerabilities in the Russian line. This was, according to Francois, the time to attack and drive the Russians out of East Prussia. Prittwitz was not so sure, but he listened to his corps commander and reluctantly agreed. On August 20th, the 8th Army attacked, splitting the Russian 1st and 2nd Armies. Fighting under the cover of darkness, the 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions smashed through Russian lines to the north, routing a Russian infantry division and taking the town of Malvishkin. Now, the Russians knew what was going on. To the south, artillery fire kept Mackensen's advance at bay, while von Bellow's reserve corps did not engage the enemy until hours later. The scene was a chaotic and lopsided one. Francois had achieved gains in the north, while in the south, the advance had been thwarted. But neither side had taken victory. There was still work to be done at Gumbinnen and still a battle to be won. By now, however, von Prittwitz's nerves were in tatters. Aerial reconnaissance suggested that the Russian Second Army was far larger than he had anticipated and was about to advance on their positions. As Francois, whose men were largely made up of native East Prussians eager to defend their homeland, reacted with incredulity, von Prittwitz telephoned Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke and announced plans to retreat to the Vistula. East Prussia, von Prittwitz said, would be abandoned to the advancing Russians. Prittwitz's military career lasted just one more day. On August 21st, 1914, Prittwitz was relieved of his duties, becoming the first commander of the war to lose his job. Paul von Hindenburg would take over at the head of the 8th Army, with Erich Ludendorff as chief of staff the following day, and would rout the Russian 1st Army at Tannenberg. Von Prittwitz returned to Germany and passed away in 1917, aged 66. Everyone makes mistakes. The difference is, when mistakes are made at the head of an army,
the results are often catastrophic. Today, we've seen 4 examples of generals who made enormous mistakes, and often made them repeatedly, resulting in huge losses of human life. Sometimes, their actions weren't mistakes at all. In the case of Luigi Cardona and Jamel Pasha, mass murder was committed under the direct order of these commanders. In the first video, we looked at 4 of the most brutal and incompetent generals, examining commanders from Britain, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Italy. And we're not quite done. In part 2, we've got 4 more generals to look at, generals whose errors and failures of judgment cost thousands of lives. This time, we're starting with Austria-Hungary. Even before the outbreak of World War I, Konrad von Hötzendorf was a controversial figure. A vocal advocate of a preemptive strike against southern neighbours Italy, von Hötzendorf was sacked in 1911 as his rhetoric pulled the Austro-Hungarian Empire closer to war. A favourite of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Hötzendorf was returned to his position as head of the General Staff in 1912. After the assassination of the Archduke precipitated conflict across the continent, Hötzendorf found the perfect outlet for his aggressive and hawkish demeanour. He would attack an increasingly expansionist Serbia in August 1914, essentially continuing the wars that had ripped across the Balkan Peninsula in the preceding years, but his troops would be split when Russia immediately entered the war on Serbia's side. Hötzendorf can't have been particularly surprised by this, as Russia had a history of intervening in conflict in the Balkans over the previous century. As the conflict wore on, the German general staff grew increasingly distrustful of their Austro-Hungarian allies. After bailing out the Austrians in Serbia and after saving them from disaster against the Russians when Hötzendorf's gung-ho tactics saw them facing down a far larger enemy, the German Empire took the reins and the Austrian high command was sidelined. Hötzendorf planned the successful joint offensive of 1915, but the message was clear. It was Germany who was in the driving seat in Central Europe. Emperor Franz Joseph I died in November 1916. His successor should have been Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a big fan of Hötzendorf's, but he had been slain in Sarajevo along with his wife 2 years earlier. Instead, Charles I acceded to the throne, and he had his own ideas of how the army should be run. Charles took control of the armed forces himself and moved for peace with the Entente powers, while Hötzendorf continued to suffer disaster after disaster. First in the South Tyrolean offensive against Italy, and then when the Russians broke through the Austrian lines at Lutsk. This was quite enough for Charles I, and he dismissed Hötzendorf from his post and sent him off to Italy. As commander of the South Tyrolean Army Group, Hötzendorf just missed out on the crushing Austrian victory at Caporetto in November 1917. Check out the first video in the series for more on what just went wrong for the Italians there. However, he was right on time for the offensive that followed, as the Austro-Hungarians drove into northeastern Italy. Tutti eroi, the Italian graffiti read. O il Piave o tutti accopati. Basically, everyone's a hero. Hold the Piave or let us all be killed. And that's what the Italians did. They held the Piave. The Second Battle of the Piave was a disaster for Hötzendorf and for Austria-Hungary, and the general was sacked again on July 15th. Austria-Hungary would live to fight another day, but only just. By November 1918, the South Tyrolean Army Group had disintegrated at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. The Empire would follow soon after. This one might come as a surprise to some. After all, this is a name that has been synonymous with the United States Armed Forces in the First World War, the namesake of Pershing Square in Los Angeles and in Manhattan, and the only general in US history to receive a 6-star rating while in service. In fact, John J. Pershing was another example of a strategist who refused to change his approach, instead of sticking to rigid policies and bloody-minded tactics that resulted in the deaths of far too many men. As the war in Europe increasingly threatened to spill across the Atlantic, the USA found that isolation was no longer working. In 1917, they joined the conflict, and American troops began arriving in Europe. Right out the gates, it was Pershing's way or the highway. The experienced French armies wanted to incorporate American divisions, swelling their ranks with new personnel while providing valuable tutelage and training for these new American recruits. Pershing was having none of this. The American army would retain its integrity, and new wine would not be poured into old bottles. There were also plans to send American units into other theaters, perhaps to the south and to Italy or to the Middle East. Again, Pershing, with his lofty ideas of glory on the Western Front, put his foot down. Pershing was looking for action, and he was going to find it. The October Revolution essentially took Russia out of the war, and the conflict ground to a halt in the east. This meant the Central Powers could focus their attention on the Western Front, where American soldiers were massing. This was Pershing's chance to put what he'd studied into action. As commander of the American forces, Pershing had had the opportunity to learn from the mistakes of the war's early years and to protect his men from the carnage of attrition. He did not do these things, instead favoring a policy of open warfare, marching directly into the industrial horrors of machine gun, tank, barbed wire, and mustard gas, rather than attempting to avoid them. Early 1918 was a disaster for the Entente. Germany's eastern resources were now pouring into the Western Front, and the Central Powers pushed the Allied lines back. At the Second Battle of the Somme, the Germans pushed forward 40 miles, and the spring offensive put German troops almost within striking distance of Paris. Pershing was rattled, and agreed to hand over command of his divisions to the French Marshal Ferdinand Foch. But summer brought a new Allied offensive. The Entente was on the front foot, and now Pershing would take back command and have his moment of glory. Even in September 1918, Pershing could not draw upon the full strength of his forces, and he still relied heavily upon British and French units along the front. Still, his men assaulted a German salient in the line, successfully pushing the enemy back to Saint-Mihiel. Next, Pershing planned to march on Metz, but Foch suggested a different target, Meuse-Argonne, a name that has become infamous among American military historians. Autumn 1918, and the 100 Days Offensive was in full swing. After losing ground over the spring and stabilizing in the summer, the plan was now to push the Germans back beyond the lines of 1914 and end the war. But the Germans, even on the back foot, still had plenty to give, and their defensive lines were solid. Pershing, still focused on defeating the enemy in open battle rather than using the trench clearing methods developed over the last 4 years of war, relied on the more experienced French and British troops as the Americans pushed on. 26,000 Americans lost their lives, with 96,000 wounded. It was the bloodiest action in the history of the US Army. It's important to note that Pershing's inability to compromise or adapt doesn't detract from the heroism and gallantry of his men. 53 Americans won the Medal of Honor, the highest award for bravery in the American military, at Meuse-Argonne. Their names, Michael Ellis, Earl Gregory, Raylan Hill, and far too many more to mention here, are forever written in the annals of history, and their contributions to bringing the war to an end are not forgotten. World War I was a true horror, something the civilians of the modern day struggle to get their heads around. Alvin York, another Medal of Honor winner, gave some impression of the chaos and confusion of those final days of the war in a diary entry. Those machine guns were spitting fire and cutting down the undergrowth. All around me, something awful. I didn't have time to dodge behind a tree or dive into a brush. I didn't even have time to kneel or lie down. As soon as the machine guns opened fire on me, I began to exchange shots with them. In order to sight me or to swing their machine guns on me, the Germans had to show their heads above the trench, and every time I saw a head, I just touched it off. Meuse-Argonne was always going to be a bloodbath, but the tactics of the American High Command put their soldiers directly into harm's way. The war was won, but at an enormous human cost. Had things been different, Robert Nivelle would not have appeared on this list at all. An experienced soldier and a veteran of numerous actions across Southeast Asia, China, and North Africa, Nivelle was almost 60 years old by the start of World War I, and yet he seemed to be one of the commanders most in tune with the unprecedented requirements of a new and horrific style of warfare. Serving as a corps commander from 1916, Nivelle saved the French army from disaster at Verdun, bringing the German offensive to a halt. This earned him a promotion, and he succeeded Philippe Pétain as head of the French Second Army. Now, he would begin his counterattacks, and in October and December 1916, Nivelle's French forces retook almost all of the ground they'd lost to the Germans over the year. Entering his 7th decade, Nivelle had become an unlikely golden boy of the French armed forces. He was nominated to succeed General Joseph Joffre as Supreme Commander of the French armies and won influential friends both at home and abroad. French Prime Minister Aristide Briand announced his full support of Nivelle. Meanwhile, in the UK, Prime Minister David Lloyd George was greatly impressed by Nivelle and his methods, which utilised an artillery screen to shield a full frontal infantry advance. For Nivelle's next offensive, Lloyd George said, the British and Commonwealth forces in France would be placed under his command. Perhaps all this adulation went to Nivelle's head. He began planning a huge offensive, which he believed would crush the Central Powers and bring peace to the Western Front. The offensive that would bear Nivelle's name would take place around Saint-Quentin-Arras, Chemin des Dames, and Champagne. From here, the French, British, and Commonwealth armies would join together into a far larger force and drive the fleeing soldiers back toward the German frontier. Nivelle, again, perhaps overestimating his own brilliance, expected victory in just 2 days, with losses of less than 10,000 men. The fact that similar claims had been made ahead of the Somme the previous year didn't seem to faze the French general. Sir Douglas Haig had misgivings. He'd been brought crashing down to earth after costly and ultimately futile actions on the Somme River. French Minister for War Hubert Leyte was similarly skeptical and resigned his post in the cabinet. But General Nivelle's reputation remained strong, and on April 9th, 1917, the attack began. The 48-hour deadline came and went. April 11th saw Australian troops assault the town of Bullecourt, part of the Hindenburg Line, losing 3,000 men and gaining nothing after a disastrous attack. Canadian forces did manage to take Vimy Ridge on April 12th, but at the expense of more than 10,000 casualties. The victory on the ridge has become part of the fabric of Canadian military legend and national identity. By April 14th, the already uncertain General Haig brought the British and Commonwealth advance to a halt, eager for news from the French contingent before committing to any further attack. When news did come, it wasn't good. The French were being slaughtered on the banks of the River Isle, and, confronted with the horror and abject futility of their position, had begun to mutiny. Rather than advancing together, British and Commonwealth forces were now encouraged to push on alone, relieving the pressure on the French troops on the Isle. Understanding he was already committed, Haig reluctantly agreed. On May 3rd, British and Australian troops took Bullecourt and occupied a chunk of the Hindenburg Line, but their shattered and exhausted soldiers could do little to press home this advantage. On May 16th, Nivelle's offensive was called off. The French had suffered 187,000 casualties, and the morale of her troops had been shaken to the very core. British and Commonwealth troops sustained more than 130,000 casualties. The offensive that was supposed to last 2 days, cost less than 10,000 men, and result in victory, had in fact lasted 5 weeks, cost 10,000 casualties every day on average, and gained very little. Nivelle took the blame for this disaster. He was sacked and dispatched off to North Africa, where Philippe Pétain took control of the French armies at the Western Front. The British forces would lead Entente actions on the Western Front for the remainder of the war. In the first video in this series, we saw how General von Prittwitz's faltering nerve and eagerness to retreat cost the officer his job and almost cost the Central Powers the entirety of East Prussia. However, the plan to retreat to the Vistula could almost be considered a brilliant feint, and it certainly had some of the Russian generals fooled. One such general was Yakov Zhilinsky, a descendant of Lithuanian nobility and one of the Imperial Army's most celebrated commanders. In August 1914, after the failed German assault at Gumbinnen, Zhilinsky was convinced that East Prussia was within Russia's grasp. He ordered General Samsonov to move his Second Army forward, pursuing what he believed were fleeing German soldiers. Zhilinsky was wrong, and Erich Ludendorff, the newly arrived German Chief of Staff, could barely believe his luck. Ludendorff sent 6 divisions against Samsonov's left wing, but knew this would not be enough to shatter the Russian advance. But General Paul von Rennenkampf had still not moved his Russian First Army from Gumbinnen, giving Ludendorff an opportunity. Leaving a thin screen of cavalry to mask his movements, Ludendorff withdrew his troops from near Gumbinnen and swung them into Samsonov's right flank, squeezing the Second Army that had now become isolated. Russia was facing its first disaster of the war. What had gone wrong? Almost everything. Yakov Zhilinsky was wrong in his assumption of what the Germans were planning to do, and he was wrong to drive Samsonov forward. He was also wrong not to coordinate an advance with Rennenkampf's First Army, and Rennenkampf was himself wrong for dawdling around Gumbinnen while the Second Army advanced alone. Communication was a huge problem for the Russian forces. The Germans knew that Russia was typically reckless in this department, sending out wireless communications on open channels with no coding or cipher protection. This meant the Germans could easily intercept enemy orders and use Russian-speaking advisors to interpret these orders with ease. All of this was bad news for the Russians in general, but it spelled total disaster for Samsonov. With Mackenson's 17th Corps now engaged on Samsonov's right flank, the Russian Second Army was almost surrounded. And yet, Samsonov was not a blameless victim of Zhilinsky's and Rennenkampf's incompetence. He allowed the orders to his own corps to be intercepted and decoded by the enemy. He'd also spread his front line over a width of almost 60 miles without the mobile forces capable of sustaining this front. This meant a huge separation between the left, center, and right of his lines, and the possibility of complete annihilation. And yet, somehow, Samsonov's army was making ground. The German 20th Corps was staggering backwards as the weight of the Russian advance bore on it. Appalled by the apparent failure to smash Samsonov, Ludendorff ordered Hermann von Francois' First Corps to attack the Russians' isolated left wing. By August 27th, the First Corps, now resupplied with a vast number of shells, unleashed a hellish artillery barrage on the advancing Russians. Samsonov's left flank crumbled, retreating desperately back toward the frontier, pursued by Francois' Germans. Francois almost succeeded in surrounding the remaining center and right flanks, but a Russian counterattack stopped them temporarily. The following day, however, Francois succeeded in wheeling across the Russian rear and blocking the Second Army's retreat. It was over for Samsonov and the Second Army. The Battle of Tannenberg was turning into a rout, as the encircled Russians, panicked and exhausted, began to surrender to the Germans. General Samsonov, realizing that he had ordered his men into a disaster, moved up to the front in an attempt to offer leadership, but it was far too late. Discipline had completely broken down, and what had been the Russian Second Army was now little more than a mass of terrified, demoralized men. At some point in the early hours of August 30th, Samsonov stepped away from his officers and walked into the nearby forest. He would end his own life with a pistol rather than submit to the humiliation of what had transpired at Tannenberg. 30,000 Russians were killed or wounded in the battle, and the scale of the German victory was enormous. However, the Germans couldn't immediately press home any strategic advantage, and the Eastern Front would solidify into a bloody stalemate that lasted 3 more years. The stories of out-of-touch generals pushing on with their own methods, even as those methods are time and time again proved not to be working, could almost be amusing if they weren't so tragic. The sad truth is that it wasn't the generals who suffered the consequences of their actions. With the exceptions of von Prittwitz, who died of natural causes, and Samsonov, who took his own life, all 8 of our generals would survive the war. Some would lose their jobs, be disgraced, be exiled, Jamal Pasha would even be assassinated later on, while others would be celebrated, promoted, or have local landmarks named after them. It wasn't these commanders who faced almost certain death in catastrophic charges or were cut off and cut down by an ill-advised advance. This was the fate of the privates and officers at the front line, with little to no say in what befell them. Imagine sitting at the controls of a contraption made from plywood and canvas, reinforced with wire. In front of you, through the thin wooden struts holding the wings together, you can see an aluminium cowled rotary engine. Between that engine and you are two Vickers machine guns, synchronized so you can, hopefully, fire a weapon without shooting off the propellers that are keeping you in the air. These propellers roar to life, and you lurch skywards. The machine, a piece of technology invented barely a decade earlier, lopes and wobbles in air currents. The battlefields of the Western Front open up beneath you and you struggle to hold your craft steady. Over the screaming of the engines, you hear the rat-a-tat-tat of gunfire. You're under attack. A plane arcs across your path and you turn and make eye contact with the enemy pilot just a few feet away from you. You see that he's just like you, filled with the same anxiety and adrenaline, the same hope of making it back home. But you must kill him, and he knows he must kill you. This was the reality for thousands of pilots who flew missions during the chaos and carnage of World War I. Kill or be killed hundreds of feet up in the air in machines that offered almost no protection from bullets and bombs. The British Sopwith Camel was one of the most famous of these planes, and its pilot spoke of the three crosses that Sopwith flyers could look forward to: the Victoria Cross for bravery and valour, the Red Cross for those wounded in combat, and the Wooden Cross for those who wound up dead. And yet, in the face of almighty peril and uncertainty, fledgling air forces made a real difference in the First World War. Today, we're going to be looking at which nation's air arm made the biggest difference, ranking 6 of the major belligerents in order, starting with the least effective and finishing up with the most. At the outbreak of war in 1914, the Russian Empire had a real asset on their side when it came to air power. This asset went by the name of Igor Sikorsky. Sikorsky was a pioneer of aviation and would later be credited with the invention of the first mass-produced helicopter. In the years leading up to the war, however, Sikorsky focused on fixed-wing aircraft and helped produce some of the most formidable fighting and flying machines of the age. In 1913, Sikorsky's company launched the Ilya Muromets or IM series of aircraft. Conceived as a luxury passenger craft, the first IMs were launched to much fanfare in an imperial Russia that was keen to modernize its image on the world stage. With the outbreak of World War I, however, the country faced a much more pressing need, and Sikorsky worked with the Russian military to convert the IM series into the world's first 4-engined heavy bomber. The IMs were tough, able to withstand massive damage on their way to their targets. They also carried a significant payload, and even a single IM could wreak havoc on the enemy lines. But they were still vulnerable to attack from enemy fighters or from anti-aircraft fire from the ground. To accompany these lumbering leviathans of the air, Sikorsky developed the S-16 biplane, a more maneuverable fighter-class aircraft. Before the war, Russia's air force consisted mainly of outdated Nieuport planes imported from France. The actions of Sikorsky and his team made Russia a real power in the air. So, what went wrong? Why did Russia end up last place on our list? Well, there's a few reasons for this. First, vulnerability. The Ilya Muromets series was backed up by the S-16, but only from 1916 onwards. For the first 2 years of the war, the IMs often lacked the protection they needed to complete their missions. Second, a lack of trust in air power. At Tannenberg in the first weeks of the war, Russian General Alexander Samsonov received aerial reconnaissance reports regarding German troop movements. He dismissed this intelligence, and this led, at least in part, to a massive Russian defeat. The poor training of pilots was also an issue. Russian pilots did not receive the same high standard of education and development as those from the Central Powers, putting them at serious risk. Equipment too. The parachute was actually a Russian invention, designed by Gleb Kotelnikov just before the war, but was delivered to the pilots of other nations long before they became part of a Russian pilot's equipment. The idea of a pilot bailing out and just losing a valuable aircraft was just too much for Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich. "Aircraft are more valuable than people," he said. "We import them from abroad, so they should be taken good care of, whereas people are never in short supply." Then there was the roster of available aircraft. Sikorsky's IMs and S-16s were great, but there was simply not enough of them. Instead, outdated Nieupors made up the bulk of the fighting force, while the Anatra biplane arrived too late to make much of a difference. Pound for pound, the Russian Air Force was simply not a match for their enemies' planes. Finally, Russia's exit from the war. Despite the views of General Samsonov and some of his compatriots, Russia's Air Force proved pivotal in many engagements, especially during the Erzurum offensive against the Ottomans in 1916. But the October Revolution of 1917 spelled the end of Russia as a force in World War I. Aeronautical engineering and technology was advancing rapidly during World War I, but many of Russia's planes barely had time to get off the ground before the fighting came to an end on the Eastern Front. It's worth remembering that the first powered flight took place in 1903, only 11 years before the outbreak of war. Today, we might look at satellite reconnaissance as a form of futuristic warfare, but this technology has been around for decades. In World War I, generals and strategists, and the pilots themselves, were working with something far closer to the cutting edge of humanity's technological capability. This is why so many nations were still playing catch-up when war was declared in 1914. Austria-Hungary had launched its Imperial and Royal Military Aeronautical Establishment, or the Kaiserliche und Königliche Militär Aeronautische Anstalt in Vienna in 1893. But this was largely focused on balloons and airships. It wasn't until 1910 that the military began experimenting with fixed-wing aircraft. As the continent lurched toward all-out conflict, Austria-Hungary was hard at work. Wiener Neustadt, Fischermend and Gurz became the centers for pilot training, and by 1913, the military had 7 aviation core bases spread across the empire. A target of 15 companies outfitted with 90 aircraft, mainly the Lerner Pfeilflieger or Arrow Flyer and the Dietrich Tauben or Dove, was set for 1914, but this plan was beset by problems, and the actual strength of the Austro-Hungarian Air Force was well below this when war was declared. But the empire had powerful friends, namely their German allies. In 1914, the rebranded Austro-Hungarian Air Force, or the Kaiserliche und Königliche Luftfahrttruppen, was kitted out with German-made Hansa Brandenburg and Avatich reconnaissance platforms, enabling the Austro-Hungarians to mount a meaningful airborne resistance as conflict began in earnest on the Eastern Front. Even by the standards of those early months of World War I, the Dietrich Taube was an anachronism. Its sleek design and construction gave the machine its bird-like name, but it was no match for the more modern craft now taking to the skies over the Eastern Front. By 1915, the Taube was all but finished, and the Luftfahrttruppen was gaining teeth. German Fokker Eindeckers, along with Austro-Hungarian-produced Lohners and Lloyd C-11s, gave the empire the fighting power it needed, but it struggled to keep pace with aeronautical development. One problem was the German attitude toward Austro-Hungarian air power. When the Fokker V4 triplane failed to rival the British Sopwith equivalent in factory testing, the German Empire didn't bother with their own formal examinations, they just passed it over to Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary was not always working with the best equipment, and they lacked the ace pilots of Germany, France and Britain. But despite all this, they maintained a strong presence in the air throughout the war, and this just about keeps them off the bottom of the list. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, 1903. The Wright brothers achieved the first powered flight, kicking off the age of heavier-than-air aviation. And yet, if the Austro-Hungarians were busy playing catch-up to their European neighbours in 1914, their cousins across the Atlantic were still on the starting line. Yes, powered flight may have originated in the USA, but the United States was way behind in the air power stakes by the time the First World War began. Except, for the US, the war didn't begin in 1914. America didn't join the conflict until 1917, giving them 3 extra years to get their house in order. In 1914, there was still no United States Air Force. The Army's Signal Corps had been using reconnaissance balloons since the Civil War in the 1860s, but this practice was not formalized until 1907. And by the beginning of the war in Europe, there were only 26 qualified aviators in the entire US military. The United States did use planes in their operations in Mexico in 1916, but the squadron consisted of only 8 aircraft, none of which was armed. Perhaps there was simply no appetite for air power in the United States in the 1910s. Well, this is not strictly true. In fact, there was an appetite, a big one. Following the United States declaration of war in 1917, $640 million was set aside by Congress for the development of an air force. National newspapers ran breathless headlines discussing the great aerial fleets that would crush the Central Powers. Colonel Reynald Bolling, Major Benjamin Falloy, who had commanded the squadron in Mexico, and General William Mitchell saw an opportunity and began lobbying for further investment and development. The appetite was there, the money was there, and the infrastructure was there. Mass-produced cars were already a fixture on American roads after all, and so the way was clear for a formidable American force in the skies. In the end, the American Air Force that saw action in the skies over Europe was cobbled together from a collection of British, French, and Italian aircraft. American-made planes like Curtis's, Benoit's, and Martin's were among them, but the bulk of the fighting force came from abroad. A little late to join the fray, the American Air Service ran missions for only 9 months, from February to November of 1918, but it certainly made its mark. The US ran 150 separate bombing missions, dropping around 138 tons of ordnance. Fighters brought down 756 enemy aircraft, while the US lost 289 planes. American squadrons constituted only 10% of the Allied planes over Europe, but they took a significant toll on their enemies. There were also American pilots operating outside of the United States military. The Lafayette Escadrille was a French squadron that consisted mainly of American volunteers. In May 1916, American ace Kiffin Rockwell achieved the squad's first kill in the skies over Alsace. The following month, Victor Chapman would be the first American airman killed in the conflict when his plane was brought down over Douaumont. As a testament to the lethal nature of these early aerial encounters, Rockwell himself would become the second fatality in September, shot through the chest by the gunner of a German Albatross he had engaged and dead before his plane hit the ground. In February 1918, many of the surviving members of the squadron were absorbed into newly formed American units. The expertise and bravery of these pilots would prove critical in the formation of the new US Air Force. Born in Nottingham in 1896, Albert Ball was barely 18 when he signed up for combat in 1914 and saw action at Passchendaele. He'd never touched a plane and had probably barely even seen one before the war, but by 1917, he was one of Britain's top fighter aces. His letters home talk of daring exploits, a distaste for killing, a cavalier attitude for his own safety, and a grim acceptance of the deaths of his comrades. The Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, famous in Germany and infamous everywhere else, described him as the best of the British flyers. Ball would not survive the war. The popular tale is that he was downed by the Red Baron's own brother, Lothar, but historians believe that it was engine failure that clipped the wings of one of the UK's best. He was reportedly so highly regarded by German troops that they considered a daring mission to return his body to the British lines, although they would eventually see sense and abandon this approach. The story of Ball is, in many ways, illustrative of what the Royal Flying Corps was all about. Pilots of astonishing bravery, doing battle in machines that were formidable on their day but prone to unreliability, scoring victories and writing their names into the history books but ultimately losing their lives, were brought down to die in unceremoniously French and Belgian fields. This is why the UK's Royal Flying Corps, or the Royal Air Force from 1918 onwards, ranks in third place on this list of the most effective aerial forces, but no higher. The First World War drove air power forwards across the continent and across the world, but in the UK the progress was nothing short of astounding. At the outbreak of the war, the average flight speed of the Royal Flying Corps aircraft was 60 miles or 97 kilometers per hour. As it became clear that aerial supremacy would be key in the conflict, speeds almost tripled, hitting 150 miles or 241 kilometers per hour, while engine power exploded from around 70 horsepower to more than 400. By the end of the war, the number of personnel involved in flying and maintaining these aircraft had grown from around 1,500 to more than 205,000. The most famous of the British planes was probably the Sopwith Camel. The biplane design has become synonymous with the dogfights and close quarters aerial combat of the First World War. This was certainly a highly capable aircraft, a deadly weapon in the hands of the most skilled fighter aces like the Australian Harry Cobby. By 1918, the ship's Camel naval variant was introduced, able to launch from aircraft carriers and adding another element to the capabilities of British air power. However, the plane proved difficult to handle and losses were heavy. It was difficult, expensive, and time-consuming to train new pilots, and Britain struggled to establish true air superiority at any point in the war. Britain made many innovations in air power during the war, including the first strategic bombing runs operated by the Royal Air Force in 1918. Despite this, the massive casualties suffered by her air crews blunted the effectiveness of her military arm. Perhaps this has contributed to the archetypal image of the British fighter ace during the First World War. Fearless, courageous, even glamorous, but doomed to an early grave. In second place on our list, France. It's no accident that the fledgling air forces of Russia and the United States were bolstered by French planes like the Nieuport. France was among the biggest producer of planes in the early decades of the 20th century, while aviation pioneers like Louis Blériot ignited the spirit of innovation and invention. France produced nearly 68,000 aircraft during World War I, supporting both their own aéronautique militaire and the air arms of their fellow allies. This is nearly 10,000 more than the British in second place and almost 20,000 more than Germany in third. At the outbreak of war in 1914, France's 138 frontline combat aircraft put her behind Russia, Germany, and Italy. This had grown to 4,500 by 1918, streets ahead of all her enemies and all her allies. But it wasn't just a matter of numbers. The French Air Force was also highly effective. Adolphe Péroux is widely considered the first fighter ace of the war, and was certainly the first to be called that after being dubbed as it by the French media. René Fonck achieved 75 confirmed victories during the conflict, and would probably be a household name to this day if it wasn't for a certain Manfred von Richthofen, who scored 5 more. Maurice Beaulieu, flying in the French-produced SPAD-8 aircraft, achieved 35 victories in just over a year and a half of combat before he was shot down and killed in September 1918. France had excellent planes and excellent flyers and proved to be the scourge of all they faced. This spectacular airborne aggression, coupled with shrewd usage of reconnaissance and observation craft, put France at the very forefront of aerial operations during the war. So why do we find France in second place? Why doesn't the Aéronautique Militaire take the top spot for our list? One factor is the scope of French innovation. Unlike most of the other nations involved in the conflict, at least those with a developed air force, France did not develop multi-engine bombers, and so they lagged behind in terms of air-to-ground attack strategies. Perhaps an even greater factor, however, is the scale of their losses. Yeah, the French produced enormous amounts of aircraft between 1914 and 1918, but they suffered immense losses too. The 52,640 aircraft that either crashed, were shot down, or otherwise damaged almost double the losses of Germany. France were great candidates for the number 1 spot, but they don't quite make it to the top of this particular list. 187 pilots scored 20 or more victories during the First World War. 75 of these pilots, more than 1/3, were flying for the German Empire. Of course, this includes Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, and his brother Lothar. But it includes less well-known names too. Werner Voss, a member of von Richthofen's famous Flying Circus, and Fritz Rümi achieved 48 and 45 victories respectively. Rudolf Berthold and Bruno Lotzer tied with the Royal Flying Corps' Albert Ball on 44, while Paul Bäumer scored 43. These Knights of the Air proved a tactical advantage, damaging and destroying expensive enemy aircraft and neutralizing pilots that the Allied powers found difficult to replace. But they also offered a psychological benefit to the troops on the ground. While the infantry struggled in the muddy hell of no man's land and faced off against one another in a warren of trenches and emplacements, fighter duels took place above the lines, up in the air, often in the most visible of locations. When German planes downed enemy aircraft, the infantry would often witness this and be cheered as a result. The German Empire was assisted by its vast manufacturing resources, and this resulted in some of the most capable aircraft deployed by any force during the war. Fokkers and Albatrosses were among the most technically advanced planes in the air at the time, while Junkers produced some of the first all-metal aircraft. German engineers and innovators were truly getting to grips with what war in the air was really all about, and they were making their expertise shown. The Battle of Verdun, which lasted for almost the entirety of 1916, showcased how important air superiority really was on the Western Front. In the first months of the battle, Germany was able to exert almost complete domination in the skies above the battlefield, gathering valuable intelligence and striking terror into the French lines. It took a massive diversion of resources to wrest back control of the air. It was a similar story at the Somme, with France relying on their vast industrial output to tip the scales in their favour, producing an enormous number of planes to counterbalance the effectiveness of the German squadrons. But while France produced more aircraft than anyone else in the war, they were consistently forced to play catch-up to the technological capability and undeniable skill of the German Air Force. Over the course of the First World War, it was the German Empire who used their aerial forces most effectively, laying the groundwork for the devastating efficacy and efficiency of the Luftwaffe 2 decades later. Of course, the Germans were far from unopposed in the sky. The 48,537 aircraft they lost put a huge strain on the military, as well as on the civilian infrastructure and domestic economy that supported the war effort. Still, losses were considerably less than those incurred on the French and British sides, and it's the German Empire that takes the crown on our list of the most effective World War I air forces. Technology and warfare tend to go hand in hand. Humankind first took flight in 1783 when Jean-François Pilatre de Rosière used technology pioneered by the Montgolfier brothers to ascend to the skies attached to a hot air balloon. Some 11 years later, the French military deployed their own hot air balloon at the Battle of Fleurus in 1794, reconnoitering enemy positions. So it was with powered flight, only 11 years after the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, European militaries were battling one another in the skies over the western and eastern fronts, turning an enormous scientific breakthrough into a weapon of death and destruction. Mercifully, we haven't yet seen the same thing happen with space rockets and shuttles. By the end of the war, no one was in any doubt. Aerial combat was the future. In the next great conflict, air power would even be more critical. The Battle of Britain and the Battle of Midway, 2 turning points in the conflict, would see aircraft playing an even greater role than ever before. Before this new conflict drew to a close, humanity would see yet another scientific breakthrough accelerated and then harnessed by the power of warfare: nuclear energy. The bonds between technology, science, and military interests, it seems, are more difficult to split than an atom. For now though, let's stay focused on the First World War. Vast, sophisticated trench networks. Entire divisions wiped off the map in desperate assaults across a cratered no man's land. Stalemates that lasted for years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. We have a very clear picture in our minds when we think of the First World War. But not every front was like this. The Western and Eastern fronts characterized the industrial horror of combat in a new century, but other areas saw markedly less action. This is not to say there wasn't bloodshed. Horror and tragedy were unavoidable in the First World War. Whether on the banks of the Piave River, in the jungles of Tanzania, or in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, human beings lost their lives in horrific fashion, cut down by the first truly global conflict the world had ever seen. But these fronts have been largely forgotten in history, pushed aside in favor of words that still carry enormous cultural weight to this day. Words like Somme, Ypres, Tannenberg, and Gallipoli. Today, we're going to shift the focus. We're going to look at some of the lesser known fronts of the war. Fronts where the fighting was not quite as ferocious, but where the lives of soldiers and civilians were ripped apart nonetheless. These are important stories, and they deserve to be told. The eastern sector of the Italian front brought about the ruin of both the Italian armed forces and the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself. The former came on November 7th, 1917, at the 12th Battle of the Isonzo, the now infamous Battle of Caporetto. Here, after more than 2 weeks of fighting, the Italian forces under Luigi Cadorna capitulated spectacularly under an Austro-Hungarian assault, falling back from the front line along the modern border with Slovenia and giving up around 100 kilometers of Italian territory in the process. The battle has become famous in Italy and elsewhere as a symbol of humiliating defeat, while Luigi Cadorna's incompetence at the head of the Italian forces has passed into legend. There are many common threads running through the First World War, but one that comes up time and time again is the idea of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. After the Italian collapse, the way was almost clear for a sweeping Austro-Hungarian victory. However, alarmed by what was going on the Isonzo, the Entente powers sent British and French divisions to halt the advance, which they did along the Piave River, some 30 kilometers from Venice. Another Austrian offensive in June would push the lines beyond the river, but as summer 1918 gave way to autumn, a new stalemate had arisen along the Italian front. This stalemate would not last though. In October, almost a year after Caporetto, Entente and Italian divisions launched a final, fatal assault. The Battle of Vittorio Veneto would be the Austrians' turn to capitulate. With their army shattered and their war effort destroyed, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was humiliated. This would be one of the key catalysts in the disintegration of the once proud Habsburg dynasty. The following month, the war would be over. The eastern sector of the Italian front was critical in many ways, keeping the Central Powers at bay in the southeast, and eventually leading to the demise of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 12 battles were fought along the Isonzo, and more were fought as Austria pushed into Italy before being repulsed. This might seem like an odd choice for this list, and in a way, it is. There are other, far more qualified candidates to come. But compared to the industrial-scale carnage of the western and eastern fronts, the Isonzo was relatively quiet. The Macedonian front is known by several different names. The Salonika front, the Thessaloniki front, or the South front, depending on who you ask. Around 600 meters long, the front traversed the rocky highlands of the southern Balkans, passing through Albania, Greece, and Bulgaria, as well as Serbia, which included the modern nation of Northern Macedonia within its 1915 territory. The front was a barrier, a bottleneck that kept the Triple Entente forces from reaching the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the north and the Ottoman Empire to the east. Along this finely poised line, the French, Serbian, British, Russian, Italian, and Greek troops of the Entente were stationed. Opposing them, Bulgarian, German, and Austro-Hungarian forces. The atmosphere was tense. Earlier in 1915, the Entente campaigns in the Dardanelles had descended into a bloody mess that left tens of thousands of British, French, Australian, and New Zealander dead on the beaches and heights of western Turkey. In the autumn of that same year, the Serbian and Montenegrin armies gallantly withstood devastating assaults from the Austro-Hungarian divisions in the west and from the Bulgarians in the east, squeezing the country in a vice. After bitter fighting, the Serbians were driven south, joining their Entente allies along the Macedonian front. This front, the Entente knew, could not fall. After the bloodshed of 1915, a new front and a new year brought relative calm to the Balkans. Romania remained neutral, and much of 1916 was given up to diplomatic negotiations with this important regional power. Greece, as well, despite the presence of their own soldiers along the line, and despite the Entente forces within their borders, also adopted a neutral position. By the summer, both had joined the Entente, each finding this to be the best option for their own nationalist interests. But Bulgarian and Austro-Hungarian actions in August took the Allied nations by surprise. The first clashes along the Macedonian front went the way of the Central Powers, but the Entente stopped their advance, retaking Florina and the highlands of Karamanchalan in September, and eventually occupying the entire Dobro-Pole Massif, a position of enormous strategic importance. As 1917 began, the Entente had essentially lost one of its newest allies. The Romanian armed forces had been shattered and the country was occupied by Entente troops eager to keep the Bulgarians contained. Throughout the year, scattered actions were fought around the town of Bitola, and close-range artillery fire made Entente control of the region impossible. Yet, the front largely remained static until the following September, when fighting stepped up several notches. Entente troops broke through the line from the Dobro-Pole Massif on September 15, 1918. Driving northward, the advancing forces sent shockwaves through Bulgarian troops, and the nation signed an armistice on September 30th, essentially leaving the Ottoman Empire exposed. The Ottomans would sign their own armistice a month later. Meanwhile, Austro-Hungarian operations in Italy were turning from an optimistic advance into a full-scale catastrophe. With the Italian border now unguarded, their Balkan territories vulnerable to attack, and their empire crumbling, the Austrians put their signature to an armistice on November 4th. The war ended 7 days later. Long periods of tense inactivity and diplomatic maneuvering characterized the Macedonian front. While the battles were smaller than those on the western and eastern fronts, with fewer casualties and mercifully less bloodshed, the sudden uptick in intensity right at the end of the war makes this an important theatre. The rapid House of Cards collapse in the southern Balkans may not have ended the war all by itself, but many historians believe this to be a crucial accelerator in the signing of the final armistice on November 11th, 1918. The colonial legacy of the 19th century still loomed large over the first decades of the 20th. Tirailleurs Senegalese fought and died as part of the French army on the Western Front. Indian Sikh troops battled courageously at the Somme and elsewhere. The Kingdom of Siam, eager to establish itself as an independent power between British and French colonies in Southeast Asia, sent their own contingent of men to join the fray in Europe. Away from the main European fronts, the war was largely fought along colonial lines. Of the main belligerents, France, Britain, Belgium, Germany, and Italy all held extensive territories in Africa, and this meant land and resources that must be defended, and men who could do the defending. Right from the outset, there was fighting in Africa. British and French troops occupied Togo in August 1914, pursuing the Germans back to Cameroon, modern-day Cameroon. At Guerrilla, the fortress changed hands several times between Entente and German troops before an amphibious landing at Douala gave Britain and France an important foothold in Cameroon. It would take another year and a half to drive the Germans out of Cameroon, during which time they would lead an incursion into Nigeria in an attempt to destabilize the British colony there. At the Battle of Gurin in 1915, the Nigerian campaign floundered. Germany would lose Malta, their final stronghold in Cameroon, in February the following year. In the east, Germany had a little more success. After a British force sailed from India and landed at Tanga, Tanzania in November 1914, hundreds of Indian troops were killed by the German and African defenders, abandoning much of their equipment as they fled. In July 1915, the Battle of Rufiji Delta was fought by British and German warships off the Tanzanian coast and on her rivers, resulting in significant losses for both sides. Inland, a more bizarre naval encounter unfolded on Lake Tanganyika, in which a small force of British motor boats, carried up on trains from South Africa and dragged through the jungle to the lake, took on 3 German craft. The motorboats knocked out 2 of the craft, but it took Belgian air power to take down the 3rd. Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, the architect of victory at Tanga, surprised the garrison in Mozambique. Lettow-Vorbeck scored another win, inflicting up to 200 casualties on the British and on neutral Portuguese troops. Some men were reportedly eaten by crocodiles while attempting to escape. This victory sustained Lettow-Vorbeck and his 1,500 men for months. Even after the armistice was signed in Europe, the colonel kept on fighting, eventually surrendering 2 weeks later in what is now Zambia. Germany's war and its African colonial ambition was finished. The scattered fighting and lower-level skirmishes of the African front make it something of a sideshow compared with the industrial bloodshed of the war's primary fronts. Despite this, colonial holdings provided valuable resources to the European powers, and this was the last of the war's fronts to officially close. Persia proclaimed its neutrality at the outbreak of the First World War, but such a strategically vital region was never going to escape the conflict unscathed. The crossroads of Asia, Persia had British India to its east, the Russian Empire to the north, and the Ottomans to the south and west. There was going to be bloodshed here, whether the Persians themselves got involved or not. Heavy Ottoman and Russian buildups in the area meant hostilities began almost right away. The Ottomans defeated the Russian Bergman offensive in November 1914, and in December, the Russians pulled out of Persia, leaving only 1 brigade and 1 battalion behind. As 1915 dawned, German agents began agitating for revolts among the local population, encouraging them to rise up and join the advancing Ottomans. In the early days of the year, the Russians launched an offensive, capturing Tabriz and Dilman and driving the Ottoman forces back. By spring, however, the Ottoman 1st Expeditionary Force was advancing under the command of Halil Bey, but a series of blunders meant they could not dislodge the Russian forces they encountered. As the year wore on, both sides found themselves distracted by actions taking place elsewhere. The Caucasus campaign siphoned off troops and resources for both sides, while Turkish forces were dealing with an allied assault along the Dardanelles. As Britain and Germany attempted to exert their own influence on local chiefs, the Russians were preparing for their most successful advance to date. In 1916, they drove southwards through Persia following the Battle of Erzurum, driving the Ottoman gendarmerie out of their strongholds. Enver Pasha, one of the 3 pashas at the head of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, prepared his invasion force, and the 2 imperial powers were deadlocked once again. Russian involvement in the war would not survive 1917. Revolution back home meant Russia was no longer a force, and their withdrawal left the Ottomans largely unopposed in Persia. The British forces in Mesopotamia seemed reluctant to push further east, and so the Armenian volunteers and resistance groups would need to fight on alone. Despite significant losses elsewhere in the Middle East, the Ottomans were still in control of the region when the armistice was signed in 1918. The Persian front brought less military bloodshed than other fronts of the war, but it took a significant toll on the civilian population. The Ottomans in particular exacted bloody revenge on the civilian populations of the areas they conquered. Thousands of Armenians, Assyrians, and Persians were massacred by advancing Ottoman forces. Even on the war's quieter fronts, the grim spectre of atrocity still haunts the conflict. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, is one of the most unique characters of the First World War. A scholar of history and architecture, as well as a civilian cartographer and explorer, Lawrence's knowledge of the Middle East and his ability to cope with the terrain and climate made him a valuable asset in this theatre. When the Arab Revolt took place in 1916, the Ottoman occupiers of the Arabian Peninsula were no match for the tough and resourceful Bedouin peoples from the south. People who were well versed in desert survival and swift movement across an inhospitable landscape. But the Ottomans were better equipped and had the weight of numbers behind them. While the British were nominally on the side of the Arabs, there was a vast gulf in terms of military tactics and cultural understanding. It would be almost impossible to achieve a cohesive response to the Ottoman occupation. But T.E. Lawrence thought differently. He understood Western martial strategy, but he admired the hardiness and wisdom of the Bedouin more. He convinced the British command that conventional warfare would be too costly in the Arabian deserts and would put British and Arab troops at risk. Instead, they'd need to hit hard, hit quick, and remain swift and mobile. They'd use small units, armed with explosives and mounted on camels, and they'd drift in and out of the desert like ghosts, striking terror into the Ottoman lines. Communication was still a problem, but Lawrence had the solution here too. Speaking fluent Arabic and fully aware of Arabian culture customs, he acted as a liaison between the Arabian Prince Faisal and the British High Command, orchestrating what he referred to as a war of detachment and writing his name in the history books in the process. If Lawrence was a unique character, then the Arabian campaigns were a unique theatre. Less focused on trench warfare and pitched battles, the Arabian Revolt was characterized by the guerrilla tactics of the Bedouin and long-range missions that were way ahead of their time. Arabia may have been a minor front in World War I, but it would shape the future of warfare in a big way. While Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces bedded down into trenches along the eastern frontier, a new front was opening up in southern Europe. Eager to force into Italy from the north, overrunning the Veneto plains that lay behind Italian lines on the Isonzo, Austrian troops mounted an offensive on May 15, 1916. They opened fire on Italian positions at Trentino, laying down a thick carpet of artillery that reduced the land to waste and left nowhere for the Italians to hide. From here, they drove toward their objective, Asiago on the Venetian plain. The Straf expedition, as it was known, looked to be successful. The Italians holed up along the Isonzo River were in danger of being cut off. Perhaps it was a case of too much, too fast for the Austrians. It became difficult to keep advance units adequately supplied, and ammunition began to dwindle. They took Asiago on May 28th, but failed to make any further progress. The Italians were digging in, keeping the Austrians from sweeping out into the open plain behind them. At Pasubio, Bovegno, and Sucna, and at the Buol Pass and Astico Valley, Italian troops hastily erected a defensive line. Prepared for the worst, they repelled desperate Austrian attacks before the invaders ran out of steam. By June 2nd, Italy was back on the offensive. 2 days later, a breakthrough on the Eastern Front sent Austria's imperial leaders into a panic. Russian troops had breached the empire for the first time. A slow counter-advance reclaimed most of Italy's lost territory, while the Austro-Hungarians would concentrate on the eastern sector of the front along the Isonzo for the remainder of the war, where, let's not forget, the final death knell would sound for the empire. Why was the Alpine front abandoned? After all, the Austrians had seen greater successes on this front than they had on the Isonzo before 1918. One major reason was logistics. The Austrian advance ran out of steam largely because of the Alpine barrier that disrupted their supply lines. High altitude maneuvers through desperate terrain cost both sides dearly, and fighting in this type of environment was just not feasible in the 1910s. It would still be savagely difficult today. Due to this, and due to the limited action seen in this mountainous landscape, the Alpine front remains one of the lesser combat theatres of the war. World War I was fought from France to Russia, from Egypt to Iran, from Cameroon to Mozambique. Men from Mumbai died alongside those from Massachusetts, Manchester, and Melbourne. Civilian communities were devastated from Belgium to Basra. This was a truly global conflict, and yet the focus still rests on the western and eastern fronts that have come to symbolize the character and identity of the Great War. Hopefully, by shedding some light on the lesser-known fronts and theatres of war, we can expand this understanding a little further, telling the stories of those victories and advances, those crippling defeats that took place outside of the scope of popular history books. Over 4 of our recent videos, we've discussed the worst jobs undertaken by military personnel in the Second World War and the Vietnam War, and seeing as we don't give a trench rat about linear progression, we'll now be heading back to the early 1900s and the so-called Great War. As with our previous videos, we won't be overlapping any examples. Best to change your socks after this one, troopers. Trench foot is some nasty business. Sappers have been boring tunnels through the ground and undermining fortifications since the ancient times, and these same tactics were employed in the First World War, during which men rotted in trench stalemates for months and years on end. The unfortunate souls consigned to tunneling duties were best described as miners, and while some miners were trained for that job specifically, many were just infantrymen made beasts of burden. The miners' main objectives were to break stalemates by tunneling under enemy trenches and caving them in with explosives, and this process could take as long as a year. All the while, miners were prone to fatigue, sickness, and gruesome death. The tunnels were often tight, dark, and cold, and they were sometimes flooded. When the earth gave way, miners were entombed, crushed, or drowned, and natural gas pockets and gases effused by man-made explosives could poison and asphyxiate them and even catch fire. Private Doland Hodge described the work as stuffy, filthy, oppressive, dangerous, and just frightful. And he went on to say, "You were down there on your hands and knees for hours on end. It was the most tiring and painful work I ever did on the Western Front." And this doesn't take into account countermining or what happened when two opposing tunnels met. When the latter occurred, underground combat would follow. The fighting was often in the dark and with daggers, picks, shovels, bits of wood, and other improvised weapons. In an interview, tunneling expert Colin Wynne said, "Some people have asked me, how did they know who they were stabbing? The simple answer is that they used to put their hand out and grab their opponent's shoulder. If he'd got an epaulet, then he was German." The largest mining operations of the Great War were carried out in Belgium during the Battle of Messines, in which tunneling companies of the Royal Engineers of the British Army, aided by British, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand miners, detonated 447 tons of explosives under German lines, killing some 10,000 Germans. Overall, the casualty rate of Allied miners was around 1,200 a month. While miners cut the earth below the surface of the battlefield, wiring parties cut barbed wire upon it. These parties, also referred to as wiring sappers or cutters, undertook a tense and dangerous job, not only cutting enemy barbed wire obstacles, but also repairing and rebuilding their own. And without these wiring parties, many more men would have been snared and killed crossing no man's land. In the cover of night, cutters would stealthily approach either their own or their enemy's lines, using a range of specialized tools to repair, rebuild, or sabotage barbed wire obstacles. While working in the dark and sleeping in the day was taxing in itself, cutters had to haul unwieldy loads over unfavorable terrain and keep ever vigilant for the eye of the enemy. Searchlights scoured the battlefield, and enemy sentries were trained specifically to look and hear for wiring parties. One wrong step, one chink of metal on metal, and they could be more bullets than men. At the start of the war, posts and pickets were used to support barbed wire structures, and these were hammered into the earth with a mallet. This, however, alerted the enemy to the cutters' positions and preceded the use of screw pickets, which could be twisted silently into the ground. In his 1936 memoir, Canadian veteran Charles Henry Savage wrote, "Working with barbed wire was a nasty job under any circumstances, but when you were handling it in the dark and within 100 yards of rifles and machine guns that would shoot at the least sound, you were doing one of the most nerve-wracking bits of work that could possibly be imagined. If a flare went up, you had to stop work and stand perfectly still, even if a bit of wire happened to be pressing into some particularly sensitive part of your anatomy. When a machine gun swept your way, it meant getting flat amongst barbed wire. The slightest move might mean death for half your party." What was worse, perhaps, is that a big part of the job was dislodging corpses caught in the wire. They could belong to both enemies and friends. As British veteran Robert Graves recalled in his memoir, Goodbye to All That, "Once, I snatched my fingers in horror from where I'd planted them on the slimy body of an old corpse. Crawling, watching, crawling, shamming dead under the blinding lights of enemy flares, and again crawling, watching, crawling." While sabotaging enemy wires was a sort of raid in itself, true trench raiders or trench sweepers set out at night to infiltrate enemy trenches, killing or capturing enemy troops, destroying or capturing equipment, gathering intelligence, and simply harrying enemy troops with the intent of disrupting their sleep and sapping their morale. Small, lightly equipped teams of trench raiders crept upon sentries in the cover of night, taking them out as quietly as they could and then proceeding to the trenches. Once in the trenches, the bayonets, trench knives, brass knuckles, spiked clubs, and entrenching tools came out. Firing a gun was a last resort, and when the raiders had achieved their objective or otherwise decided it was time to give it legs, they got rid of all their grenades, covering their exit with shrapnel. Sidney Matt of the London Regiment described the onset of a raid. The idea was to crawl through the German wire and try and get underneath and jump into their frontline trench, dispose whoever was holding it by bayonet, if possible without making any noise, or clubbing over the head with the butt. Then you drop into the trench. Charles Quinnell of the Royal Fusiliers saw the raids as pointless. It was a waste of time. We just hated it. There was some general about 30 miles behind the lines wanting to know who was on the opposite side. He ought to have the job himself. Agreeing with Quinnell was an officer only known as F. Jourdain. Every raid I've heard of always involved a disproportionate number of casualties for what they got out of it. An officer in the Gloucestershire regiment known as Charles Wilson, however, thought trench raids were necessary to find out what troops were in the line opposite. Wilson also said another benefit was to get the men accustomed to getting out into no man's land, not to feel that they must be safe in a trench. Now, as we just said, on the other hand of a trench raid were sentries, troops charged with keeping an eye out for the enemy and alerting their friends. It was for this reason that they were prime targets, just like radio operators. Additionally, sentries were not afforded the same degree of cover as their friends deeper in the trenches or in bunkers, and they could not, by military law, fall asleep, lest they pay the ultimate price. In British soldier Harry Drinkwater's diary, the following account was recorded. Snowed all night. Had a hard job to keep awake. One or two fellows, of whom I was one, were found to be fast asleep at the end of their sentry. We'd gone to sleep standing up, and the relief man was also asleep. Under military law, this is a crime of the first water, punishable by execution. New Zealand Private John Jack Dunn came down with pneumonia in Gallipoli, and after receiving treatment in a hospital on a Greek island, he was found asleep on sentry duty. For his offence, Dunn was court-martialed and sentenced to death according to the following clause in the Manual of Military Law. A sentinel found asleep or drunk at his post while on active service would, if the character and circumstances of the offence were sufficiently grave, be liable to suffer death. On further appeal, however, with consideration to his illness, Dunn's sentence was remitted and he was sentenced instead to just 10 years of hard labour. The poor man died in war before he could carry the sentence out, however. One French soldier, on the other hand, thought sleep was near impossible. The time crawls as if paralysed. This guard duty will never end. The man who was determined not to sleep can feel his eyes about to close, but he will not sleep. He will feel the cold and the rain. He will slip occasionally into swift unconsciousness, but he will not sleep. There is always the rain, always the winter, always the shadow.
Africa has been a hotbed of conflict for the last century. As the colonial regimes of the old world withered, the shadow of the Cold War enveloped the continent. Vast natural resources were discovered and weapons proliferated, providing the means for idealists and renegades to take power for themselves. This is Untangling Africa, and in this episode, we're stepping back in time to the turn of the 20th century, where we'll shed light on one of the greatest guerrilla campaigns the world has ever seen. Germany took over the region later called German East Africa in 1885 during the final stages of the European scramble for Africa. The German Chancellor at the time, Otto von Bismarck, wasn't too keen on Germany having colonies far away from Europe. He believed colonial holdings promised only expenditure and diplomatic complications with other major powers on the continent. This policy meant that, while its surrounding Belgian and British colonies were relatively well supplied, German East Africa was not. The small number of German officials there had to make do with what they had, and forging alliances with various chiefs and tribal councils became key for governance. The city of Dar es Salaam, the modern-day capital of Tanzania, was the German base of operations. Before the outbreak of World War I, it had a population of 160,000, and its modern port facilities received over 1,500 vessels each year. The Germans linked this coastal metropolis to the colony's hinterland with a railway network that continues to run right across modern Tanzania. But construction projects like these necessitated contact with different tribal groups, and they weren't about to let some foreigners waltz in and take their land. The Germans needed an army. The soldiers of this colonial army were known as askaris, a word taken from the local language Swahili meaning soldier.
They were predominantly recruited from territories outside of German control, particularly Egypt and Sudan. These were young men who had lost out in the colonial game, often taken from their villages and forced to fight for the British or French without pay. They had experience in modern warfare but were destitute. Serving in the German colonial army, the Schutztruppe offered both a career and social advancement. As outsiders, these men also had no qualms about putting down rebellions inside German-held territory. Between 1885 and 1914, a core group of 2,700 Askaris formed under the command of German officers. They may have been slaves and serfs before, but now they were proud, trusted soldiers. In the words of historian Juhani Kopponen, during German rule, the trustworthiness of Askaris was never taken for granted. It was conceived as an acquired trait to be fostered with care and a generous salary. This wasn't the case for the locally recruited soldiers just over the border in Belgian Congo, however, and this contrast would have lasting consequences for the coming war in East Africa. On April 13th, 1914, an up-and-coming Prussian lieutenant colonel named Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck took command of German East Africa's Schutztruppe. He had come over from the German colony in Namibia, where he'd fought against the Herero insurrection. It was here that the young man learned the arts of guerrilla warfare. He noted his enemy could live off the land and move far quicker than the lumbering German units sent to intercept them. Their bushcraft skills amazed him, and he learnt as much as he could from enemy POWs. But like the rest of the German colonial administrators, von Lettow-Vorbeck was complicit in the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples after the defeat of the insurgency. 65,000 people were deliberately killed in what was, in effect, a miniature Holocaust. For von Lettow-Vorbeck, this was the price of defeat. Once he had arrived in German East Africa, von Lettow-Vorbeck took charge of the Askaris and formed them into 14 field companies. He knew that such a small force could not hope to win a major war for Germany in Africa, but that wasn't his plan. Just as a buffalo can be sent mad by the incessant bites of a tsetse fly, so too could von Lettow-Vorbeck's Askaris torment the armies of the Entente. He would tie up their soldiers and resources, forcing them to divert attention away from the battlefields of Europe. It was a noble goal, but few of von Lettow-Vorbeck's contemporaries believed he could do it. German East Africa's geography made resupply from Europe virtually impossible, and British forces in Kenya to the north and Rhodesia to the south were far better equipped than the Askaris, who were still using single-shot black powder rifles. Heinrich Schnee, von Lettow-Vorbeck's superior, wanted desperately to keep the colony neutral per the Congo Act of 1885, which mandated the neutrality of all of European colonies in Africa in the event of a war in Europe. But von Lettow-Vorbeck wouldn't listen to him, and this proved fortunate. If he had, the British would have likely crushed him in the first major battle. The Great War came to German East Africa in July 1914. Fighting, however, remained relatively contained. Askaris took part in several raids and border skirmishes against British soldiers of the King's Africa Rifles, though none were decisive. The first major battle of the campaign occurred at the port of Tanga in November. The British plan was simple. 8,000 men of the King's African Rifles, British Indian Army and Royal North Lancashire Regiment were loaded up in transports to the east of Tanga. They would launch an amphibious assault and storm the city, capture the railhead and knock the German colony out of the war in time for tea and medals. What could go wrong? Before the attack commenced, the captain of one British troop transport landed ashore and met with Tanga's German mayor. He felt it was only sporting to let the Germans know they were coming, and he inquired as to whether Tanga's harbour was mined. It wasn't, but the Germans assured the Brits that it was chock full of them. Convinced, the captain returned to his ship. This gave the Germans time to organise their defence. Initially, only one Askari company was available, but von Lettow-Vorbeck arrived just before the battle with 3 more. 1,000 Askari and German troops now stood against 8,000 men. The British landed unopposed and unloaded their supplies onto the beach. They then advanced through the tangle of oil palms toward Tanga's outskirts. Lurking ahead of them in well-concealed positions was the Askari vanguard. They waited until the British formation had been broken by the terrain, then opened fire. rifle fire cut down scores of British soldiers. The undertrained and under-equipped Indians were bogged down in the south, while the Lancastrians advanced north. They broke through into Tonga, but in the house-to-house fighting, the Askaris made them pay with blood for every step. The British line, now hopelessly extended, von Lettow-Vorbeck attacked the weak centre, aiming to encircle the Lancastrians in the city. At the last moment, British officers realised what was happening and pulled back their men in a chaotic retreat. When the Indians saw them running, they joined the rout too, going hell for leather back to the landing ships. Behind them, the Askaris bellowed tribal war cries, which reportedly terrified the British. They evacuated, leaving all their supplies to the Germans. For von Lettow-Vorbeck, the victory at Tonga could scarcely have been more complete. He captured enough weapons, medicine, uniforms, ammunition, and equipment on the landing beach to keep his men kitted out for at least a year. He lost 71 men, but had inflicted 995 casualties on the enemy. The catastrophic defeat at Tonga and another subsequent defeat at Longido, in which the Askari were outnumbered 4-1, crushed the British ambitions in German East Africa. But King George's empire wasn't out of the fight. Between December 1914 and February 1916, the British gathered strength. South African General Jan Smuts was put in command of 100,000 men from Britain, Rhodesia, South Africa, India, the Belgian Congo, and Portuguese Mozambique. Opposing him, von Lettow-Vorbeck had just 14,000 Askari. He knew he couldn't win a pitched battle, so he fought as the Herero had in Namibia, with guerrilla tactics. In March 1916, Smuts launched several massive incursions into German East Africa, forcing von Lettow-Vorbeck away from the borderlands into the colony's centre. Here, Smuts planned to surround and crush the beleaguered German force, but it was not to be. Von Lettow-Vorbeck split his army into 3 highly mobile columns, which attacked different points in the Entente rear simultaneously. The Askari never engaged in a conventional battle, instead retreating whenever victory wasn't assured. Ahead of Smuts' force, they burned villages and farmland to deny supplies to the enemy. Soon, British losses to disease began outstripping losses to combat. In the words of one soldier, "The Hun has with the greatest care denuded the whole country of supplies before us and called into his aid his 2 great allies, the tsetse fly and horse sickness, to rob us of our live cattle and transport animals on the way." Throughout 1916 and 1917, von Lettow-Vorbeck carried on with this elusive form of warfare. Although the British perimeter continued tightening, he always found a way to escape and attack the enemy unexpectedly. Ammunition shortages, however, were a constant issue. As black powder cartridges for their Mausers became harder and harder to come by, Askari equipped themselves with whatever they could find, including old muskets. These shortages seriously dented their operational strength, and attrition reduced the force in number. But von Lettow-Vorbeck had some fight in him yet. After being pushed out of German East Africa, he fought all the way through Portuguese Mozambique and into Rhodesia, the only successful German invasion of British territory during the First World War. Only 2 months later, it was all over. The armistice was announced, and the as yet defeated Major General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck surrendered. The campaign had bogged down some 400,000 British servicemen and cost over £12 billion in today's money. German East Africa was handed to the British, but it was left an empty husk. Over 1 million civilians were dead, and it would be decades before the region would come close to recovery. After the conflict, von Lettow-Vorbeck was venerated by both the Germans and the British. But the loyal Askari were largely forgotten. They had to wait until 1964, the year von Lettow-Vorbeck died, to be paid for their service. However, most could not provide concrete proof to the German bureaucrats that they had fought. That was until one German officer began calling out drill orders. The old men fell in immediately, and every one of them could still precisely execute the manual of arms. It's the First World War, and you've got to get soldiers from Ukraine to France, but without going through an Axis country. What do? Naturally, you go east. Fight through the Bolsheviks, take over the Russian railway network, capture most of Siberia, and reach Vladivostok before the ships arrive to get you home. All of this while losing less than 10% of your men over 3 years of fighting. It might sound crazy, but this is the story of the Czechoslovak Legion. When the Great War broke out in 1914, ethnic Czechs and Slovaks living in Russia petitioned the Tsar to be allowed their own Czechoslovak unit in the Russian army. The Czechs had been historically mistreated by the Austrians and held a grudge. The Slovaks resented Hungarian domination of their homeland. The Russian government immediately recognized that an entire unit pissed off with the Austro-Hungarians would make a great fighting force. The unit was named Družina, which meant companions, and sent to the front line along with the Imperial Russian army. The Tsar had let the cat out of the bag, and within 5 years he'd be dead because of it. The Czechoslovak soldiers were playing the long game, not just fighting because they hated the Austro-Hungarians, but because they planned to use the Legion as a bargaining chip after the war. They knew that when Austria-Hungary fell, there'd be land up for grabs, and the Czechoslovaks wanted a chunk of it. The Družina was founded with 720 soldiers and 21 officers in September 1914. With such limited numbers, the Czechoslovaks were turned into a reconnaissance force and served with the Imperial Russian Army on the Eastern Front. The Czech leaders knew that to preserve the unit's independence from the Russians, they would have to expand rapidly. To accomplish this, they ramped up recruiting efforts in areas of Russia with high Czech populations. Most of the soldiers were bilingual and used their language abilities to convince fellow Czechs and Slovaks in the Austro-Hungarian trenches to defect. This was remarkably successful, as Czechs and Slovaks were treated well by the Russians. Fresh recruits swelled the ranks, and by April 1916, the Družina had become the 2,436-strong Czechoslovak Rifle Brigade. In the spring, this fledgling force took part in the infamous Brusilov offensive. This massive operation was Russia's greatest feat of the war, but lost them over 500,000 men. Launched in western Ukraine on June 4, 1916, Russian and Czechoslovak forces attacked several weak points in the Austro-Hungarian line, causing it to break. The 1.732 million strong force smashed through the broken lines and forced the Axis onto the defensive. The Czechoslovaks became famous for their fighting spirit and discipline during the attack. General Brusilov, the overall commander, commented, "They fought magnificently at the front and always displayed great bravery." In early 1917, another Czech regiment was added to the brigade. In stark contrast to the rest of the Russian forces, their morale was high. The Tsar abdicated in March, and Bolsheviks were gaining ground across Russia with their fierce anti-war stance. Russian soldiers, many of whom were swayed by the Bolshevik rhetoric, were becoming increasingly unreliable. The Kerensky offensive was launched in July 1917. It was the last Russian offensive of the war and quashed what remained of their shattered morale. The only victory in the entire offensive was the Battle of Zborov, where Czechoslovak soldiers overran the Austrian lines. The offensive was a failure, but the propaganda victory for the Czechoslovaks was enormous. The Russian provincial government released them from all restrictions, and the unit quickly grew. With the addition of artillery batteries and thousands of volunteers, the newly named Czechoslovak Legion was 40,000 strong by 1918. In February 1916, Tomáš Masaryk founded the Czechoslovak National Council in Paris, an organization dedicated to building a Czechoslovak homeland. Less than 2 years later, Imperial Russia gave way to the Bolsheviks in the October Revolution. Masaryk was in de facto command of the Legion and managed to have it incorporated into the French army. The French were paying the bills, but only because Masaryk had promised to get the Legion to France so they could fight the Germans in the west. With Russia out of the war and German reinforcements coming from the east, France's position was starting to look shaky. The problem was, while Soviet Russia had thrown in the towel, the rest of the Axis powers were still fighting. They were excellent soldiers, but the Czechoslovak legionnaires didn't fancy fighting all the way across the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they took the obvious choice and decided to travel to the Pacific port of Vladivostok, which was 9,700 kilometers from their recruiting base in Kiev, then get a ship to France. In March 1918, the Soviet leadership and the Czechs signed the Penza Agreement, a document guaranteeing the Czechoslovaks safe passage so long as they gave up most of their weapons. There was distrust on all sides. The Soviets expected the Legion to join White Russian rebels in Siberia, and the Legionnaires were already dealing with Bolshevik subversion in their ranks. Additionally, the Legionnaires had been fighting off a German attack for the previous month and a half, giving them even less reason to lay down arms. The Legion gave up some weapons, but concealed most of them in the trains which carried them to Siberia. Their progress was infuriatingly slow as the railways were in a terrible state and local Soviet administrators continually demanded bribes. By May 1918, the Legion was strung out along thousands of kilometers of the Trans-Siberian Railway. While the Legion was traveling east to Vladivostok, Hungarian POWs were traveling west from Siberian prison camps. They crossed paths in Chelyabinsk on May 14th. Some of the Hungarians had been complicit in a massacre of Czech wounded, and the Legionnaires decided to get revenge. News of the resulting incident reached the Soviet Commissar for War, Leon Trotsky, who demanded the Legion be completely disarmed and arrested. The Legionnaires were sick of Soviet meddling and refused to cooperate, taking over the city of Chelyabinsk. This sparked the revolt of the legions. News of the revolt spread quickly along the Trans-Siberian Railway, and the strung-out Legion moved to secure its tenuous position. Legionnaires captured key cities along the railway, including Vladivostok, to prevent the Bolsheviks from halting their trains. Their primary objective was to leave Russia and get to France, so they stayed on the defensive. It was unintended, but the near total capture of the Trans-Siberian Railway by what was now a hostile army had serious knock-on effects for the Russian Civil War. The Legion had decisively pushed the Bolsheviks from Siberia, making it a haven for White Russian rebels. It also had dire consequences for the Romanovs, as the Bolsheviks had moved Tsar Nicholas II and his family to the Siberian city of Yekaterinburg. It was only 230 kilometers from Yekaterinburg and Chelyabinsk, and the Bolsheviks couldn't risk losing the Romanovs to the Czechoslovaks, who could safely move them to Europe. On Lenin's personal command, the last Tsar and his family were executed by firing squad and buried in the Siberian wilderness. The Legion arrived 5 days later. By mid-July, the Czechoslovak Legion controlled the Trans-Siberian Railway from Samara to Irkutsk. White Russian administrators and Cossack warlords were setting up governments in the regions controlled by the Legion, but the Red Army was gaining strength by the day. In September, the Reds pushed back, taking Samara and forcing the Legion east. They fought hard, but Czechoslovak morale fell sharply. Czechoslovak statehood was declared in Prague on October 28th, and the war was coming to an end. Fledgling Czechoslovakia was already fighting border wars, and the Legionnaires were desperate to get home and protect their new country. Their willpower to fight the Red Army finally dissipated when Admiral Kolchak overthrew the White Russian government, establishing a dictatorship over White Russian Siberia. Uprisings and bloodshed splattered across Kolchak's dominion. His White Army was disorganized and suffering heavy losses to the Reds. His forces in disarray, Kolchak boarded a train on the Legion-controlled Trans-Siberian Railway. The Legionnaires were sick of fighting in Siberia and called a truce, handing their ally Kolchak over to the Reds in return for safe passage to Vladivostok. This time, the Soviets didn't try to take their guns and let the Legion go home. With over 50,000 soldiers spread across the Trans-Siberian Railway, it was over a year before the last of the Legionnaires made it to Vladivostok. Their journey wasn't eased by the Allies, who deliberately hampered their progress in an attempt to inflame hostilities with the Red Army. The Legionnaires didn't take the bait, and by March 1920, the last Czechoslovak train entered Vladivostok. Around 60,000 Legion soldiers and officers evacuated Vladivostok with around 10,000 more civilian refugees. They returned to Europe and were received in their new country with a hero's welcome. Many of these battle-hardened veterans formed the core of the new Czechoslovak army. Their journey from the battlefields of the Eastern Front across Siberia and finally to a new home in Europe had been truly epic. In the words of Winston Churchill, the pages of history recall scarcely any parallel episode at once so romantic in character and so extensive in scale. And from Theodore Roosevelt, the extraordinary nature of whose great and heroic feat is literally unparalleled, so far as I know, in ancient or modern warfare. The British were working on something, although no one was quite sure what. Some kind of structure, perhaps a mobile structure, perhaps armed. Or maybe a new kind of static building, like a turret or fortification. As rumours of German spies and intelligence operatives became increasingly common, the British needed a way to disguise what it was they were building. They started referring to it as a water storage device, a water carrier, and, eventually, tank. The name stuck. When these vehicles rolled onto the Western Front in 1916, the enemy saw that these tanks weren't water tanks at all, but a new kind of fighting machine. A realization of a vision Leonardo da Vinci had centuries before. A new age of mechanized warfare was beginning. But how effective were these new machines? What was the impact on the enemy? Join us as we explore the realities of tank warfare on the Western Front. From Flers-Courcelette to Cambrai to Amiens. The summer of 1916 had come and gone. And yet, with autumn fast approaching, British, Commonwealth and French forces were still deadlocked against the German Empire on the Somme. Now, more than 10 weeks after that bloody first day that had swallowed up over 26,000 lives in just a few hours, the British commanders were planning a new offensive. There had been some successes for the Entente over an otherwise grim summer. Around the centre of the battlefield, the German line had been pushed back, as much as 8 kilometers in some cases. But each meter of ground gained meant casualties the Entente could ill afford. So, at Flers-Courcelette on September 15th, the British and Commonwealth forces would try something a little different. The Entente forces employed 2 tactical and technological innovations at Flers-Courcelette. First, leaning on the barrage, in which infantry would advance tightly upon a creeping artillery barrage designed to shake the enemy from their positions. Previously, artillery barrages had shattered enemy positions, but these positions were manned and resupplied by the time the infantry reached them. The tight formation would enable positions to be taken and occupied immediately. Second, a horrifying new technology, the creaking, lumbering machine of war known as the Mark I tank. Crewed by 8 men decked out in medieval-style chainmail armor and helmets to protect them from shrapnel and stray bullets, these leviathans weighed in at 28.4 metric tons, with armor between 5.8 and 11.9 millimeters thick. 2 6-pounder Hotchkiss QF guns and 3 Hotchkiss machine guns meant the Mark I could do more than absorb fire. It could shoot back too. Even at top speed, the Mark I traveled essentially at a walking pace, making it the perfect accompaniment to the slow infantry advance behind the screen of the barrage. Unlike the infantry on foot, however, the Mark I could break down at any time. To the men secreted within the great hull, every lurch forward would have been met with anxiety and trepidation, as the crew wondered if this would be the moment their machine gave up on them. The Germans had never seen anything quite like this before. The development of the Mark I had been top secret, and watching these metal monsters lumbering out of the smoke and debris like miniature castles mounted on caterpillar tracks put the fear of God into the defenders. Some even surrendered at the first sight of these beasts as they advanced over barbed wire and trenches with bullets bouncing off them. Tactically, the tanks were a limited success. The 4th Army had 49 tanks, but not all of these would be used. 7 accompanied the Canadian troops on their advance. 3 were assigned to attack the German position known as Quadrilateral, southwest of Martinpuich, while 9 of the beasts advanced with the Guards Division toward Morval and Lebu to the northeast. The Battle of Flers-Courcelette was a qualified success. By September 22nd, the lines had moved beyond both Flers and Courcelette, pushing the Germans further back, but they did not reach Morval and Lebu. The Mark I had had only a limited impact on the advance. In fact, by September 16th, only 3 of the steel beasts remained operational. However, one thing was certain: the the tank had arrived and warfare was about to change forever. As December began, the British troops on the Borloo Ridge understood they were in trouble. What had been an important salient in the German line was rapidly turning into a death trap as artillery smashed into the positions on the higher ground and the German counterattack began in earnest. With enemy divisions now advancing across all other sections of the line, the British risked being completely cut off. When German troops took the Bonavere Ridge to the south, the situation went from bad to worse for the British, and a partial retreat began on the 3rd. By the 7th, almost all of the Entente gains around Cambrai had been reversed. The British still held Avrincourt, Ribecourt and Fliquier along the Hindenburg line, representing a small victory. But the Germans had taken territory at Gonelio further south along the line. Once again, on the Western Front, a costly but optimistic advance had given way to bloody, senseless slaughter and a tactical stalemate. The Battle of Cambrai would have little to no impact on the outcome of hostilities along the front. The Entente would need to find another way through as the war entered its 4th year. The timeline of the Western Front is dotted with many battles like this one. And yet, the Battle of Cambrai is often mentioned in the same breath as more monumental struggles, like those at the Somme, Ypres, Arras, or Verdun, in the list of definitive actions along the front. Why is this? To find out, we need to roll back the clock by 2 weeks and learn more about just why those British troops found themselves up on the Borloo Ridge in the first place. The fields of Flanders are characterized by swampy terrain with soft earth that bogged down infantry advances and swamped military vehicles. After 3 years of combat, this terrain had been churned up even more, becoming a hellish landscape of crater and mud. By now though, more than a year after Flers-Courcelette, the Entente had a new and far more formidable weapon, the Mark IV tank. This was a much tougher customer than the Mark I, with thicker armor, up to 12mm, and a shorter barreled version of the Hotchkiss QF gun. The Hotchkiss was now a 6-pounder rather than a quarter-pounder. There were also Lewis machine guns rather than the Hotchkiss and Vickers guns previously used. The machine was supposed to be safer for the crew inside too, thanks not only to the thicker armor but also to its design and layout. 2 rear track horns protected the fuel tank, preventing the potentially catastrophic fires that had made the Mark I vulnerable in some situations. The Mark IV was incredibly exciting for the British command and sent shockwaves of fear through German troops. At Messines Ridge in June of 1917, the vehicle had performed admirably, but in July and August, attempts to deploy them at the Third Battle of Ypres had proved disastrous due to the swampy terrain. The Mark IV would not be an antidote to the quagmires of Flanders. British generals needed a new location to show what their new toy could do. They chose Cambrai. The initial plan was put together by Lieutenant Colonel JFC Boney Fuller, whose idea to attack Saint-Quentin with tanks evolved into a strategy to assault Cambrai. At the same time, Brigadier General H.H. Tudor had his own plan, formulating an armoured raid on the German trenches with no preliminary bombardment. An audacious plan that would retain the element of surprise until the very last moment. Elements of this strategy would also be used in the planning for Cambrai. In the end, the British wouldn't be able to take full advantage of this surprise. The German forces knew something was up, and they expected an attack on Avrincourt from an infantry force with tank support. There was also a preliminary barrage, against the wishes of General Tudor. At around dawn, the 3rd and 4th Infantry Corps, along with 9 battalions of the Tank Corps, began their assault behind a creeping barrage. Compared to what had gone before, this was a massive tank force, 437 in total, of which 378 were fighting tanks. It looked as if everything was going well. Progress was being made right across the battlefield, with advance units now up to 8 kilometers beyond the Hindenburg line. The 12th Infantry Division reached Lettow Wood on the right flank, digging in there, while the 20th reached Manière before the weight of a tank crushed the bridge there and halted the advance. The 6th Division, in the centre of the field, moved beyond Ribecourt and Mâcon, but was pushed back from their next objective at Noyelles. But there was a problem: Fliquier. This had been the first objective for the 51st Highlanders, but the heavy defences around the area made capture almost impossible. Using an unorthodox tank strategy, different to that of other battalions along the line, Major General George Harper found that his armour was being picked off as his men advanced. Around 40 of these vehicles were knocked out by artillery, and an experienced anti-tank brigade stationed at Fliquier wreaked havoc among the advancing Mark IVs. The actions at Fliquier have passed into the stuff of legend and mythology, giving rise to stories of a lone gunner taking out British tanks single-handedly around the village. The lone gunner is almost certainly a fiction born out of the fog of war, like the Angels of Mons or the White Stockings of Russian military urban legend from decades later. But the situation itself was very real. The British were now losing tanks and the advance was sagging at Fliquier. As the advance units pushed a salient into the line at Bourlon, the British began to take stock of what they had achieved. In 6 hours, they'd pushed further beyond the German lines than in 3 months of fighting in Flanders, and they'd taken significantly fewer casualties. There were still huge numbers of dead and wounded, but the grim, drawn-out horror of Passchendaele, where major fighting had ceased less than 2 weeks before, was not repeated. The lopsided nature of the advance left the units at Bourlon exposed, and much of the swift advance was reversed. But the Tank Corps had shown just what it could do. If tanks had arrived at Flers-Courcelette, then they had really begun to prove themselves at Cambrai. Tanks were still new and frightening in 1917, but they weren't viewed in the way they had been the year before. As the lumbering beasts crawled out of the smoke, the Germans would have known exactly what they were, and their arrival would not have been a surprise. The machines were still terrifying, especially in their new and improved Mark IV iteration, but some sections of the German line understood just how to deal with these monsters. Around Fliquier, an anti-tank unit that had honed its skills against French hardware during the Nivelle offensive achieved real successes, and the German troops knew that these vehicles could be stopped with the right approaches. Artillery fire also proved highly effective. But we're forgetting 2 things here. One, the scale of the Tank Corps' involvement at Cambrai. The sight of hundreds of tanks advancing up and down the line must have struck terror into the hearts of the German defenders. 2, the initial successes. The might of the Mark IVs managed to punch an enormous hole into the German lines. Yes, reinforcements arrived to save the day for the Germans at Cambrai, and the battle resulted in something of a stalemate. But the sweeping speed of the Tank Corps' advance would have been sobering for the German command. Even in its final year, the outcome of the war was very much in the balance. The collapse of the Eastern Front following the Russian Revolution meant the Central Powers could focus more resources, chiefly German resources, on the Western Front. The entrance of the Americans to the war in 1917 had tipped the balance marginally in the Entente's favour, but a bolstered Germany found herself able to launch the massive and possibly decisive assault she really needed. The German Spring Offensive, also known as the Ludendorff Offensive, transformed the stalemate in the west, pushing the lines back by over 60 kilometers in some sectors. It was a huge victory and the biggest advance on the Western Front since 1914. But it was also extremely costly. The Germans were exhausted, shattered, with casualty figures reaching almost 690,000. And even after all that, they had failed to end the war. Once the German offensive ran out of steam in July 1918, it would take the Entente only 3 weeks to mount a counterattack of their own. The 100 Days Offensive began at Amiens on August 8th. The Germans had needed something decisive, and they'd failed to achieve it. Now, the Entente would have their turn. The biggest tank offensive the world had ever seen up to this point was about to begin. This time, there would be no preliminary bombardment. The Entente forces had moved into position in secret, and they would stay that way right up until 4:20 AM on August 8th, when the heavy artillery opened up. Morale was low in the German trenches after the disappointment of the spring offensive, and communication was lacking between their three lines of defense. As the bombardment came to a halt, the German troops would have had only a few minutes to contemplate what was now rolling toward them. A combined arms assault of around 600 tanks, thousands of infantry, and air support from planes overhead. The initial assault was carried out by 2 Australian divisions, 2 British, and 3 Canadian, and it progressed at a high speed. The Australians reached their first objectives just after 7 AM, and by 8:20 AM, both the Australians and the Canadians had breached the German lines. Armoured cars and cavalry brigades harried the German forces, who were now in chaos, while the recently formed Royal Air Force inflicted heavy casualties. By 11 AM, the line had moved back 3 miles. As German soldiers gave themselves up in their thousands, Entente troops found themselves accepting the surrender of officers and divisional staff who would normally have been nowhere near the front. The French troops on the right of the battlefield were also on the move now. They'd taken Morhaix at 9:30 AM and were now shelling the German positions beyond this point. By the end of the day, a 15-mile section of the German line south of the Somme had been obliterated. In the north, there were gains too, but these were a little more limited as the terrain made advances difficult. While the speed of the infantry advance actually meant that tanks could not always keep up, the Mark V's and other pieces of hardware under the Allied command were highly effective at Amiens. The reliability issues that had plagued earlier versions of the tank were largely ironed out on the Mark V, and the latest iterations were better equipped and more maneuverable than what had gone before. While many Mark V's were lost, a great number of them survived their actions almost unscathed. The Barhead Mark V, serving with the 27th Australian Infantry Battalion, was critical in taking the villages of Bayonville and Abonnier, even advancing to the Blue Line, the furthest point reached by the Entente on that opening day. On returning to the rallying point, Barhead was described as being in splendid condition. The medium A Whippet tank was also deployed, capable of reaching speeds of up to 13 km per hour. At this stage in the war, the Entente not only had better tanks, they had more of them, and they brought these vehicles to bear on the beleaguered Germans in a big way. Like at Cambrai, the appearance of these machines of war was probably not enough to terrify the Germans the way they had in 1916. However, the lightning, or at least much quicker than what had gone before, advance, the combined arms tactics, and the skill of the tank crews were all devastatingly effective at Amiens. The German defenders, already plumbing the depth of morale, would have been shattered by the sudden arrival of some 600 tanks, along with the infantry, planes, and armoured cars that came with them. August 8, 1918 was just the first day of the 100 Days Offensive, but in many ways, it was the beginning of the end. The bloody stalemate of trench warfare was giving way to something more mobile, more capable of ending resistance in a matter of weeks, rather than years. Only 5 days later, a meeting of the top German military and political figures concluded that a victory for the Central Powers on the battlefield was almost impossible. For Germany's allies in Europe, the situation was even worse. Austria-Hungary had lost the Second Battle of the Piave to the Italians in June, and now announced they could not fight beyond the winter. Bulgaria would end their involvement in the war following the Vardar offensive in Macedonia in September. As Vardar was winding down, the last major offensive of the Western Front was kicking off at Meuse-Argonne. The following month, a revolution would tear through Germany. It was all over, and the armistice of November 11th would make it official. While we can't blame a single day for the collapse of Germany in World War I, the first day at Amiens certainly played a pivotal role. General Ludendorff would describe August 8, 1918 as the Black Day of the German army. The presence of all those tanks might not have ended the war, but it certainly hastened its conclusion. What would it have felt like to face down a tank on the Western Front in World War I? Almost certainly, it would have been terrifying. These were new machines. They were loud, massive. They were tough, repelling bullets and demolishing defensive structures. Men would scream in agony and fear as they were cut down in no man's land, but these lumbering monsters would roll on, cold and unfeeling. We can't overstate the psychological effect this must have had on the German troops, as well as the psychological boost it offered to Entente forces. But over time, countermeasures would have become more sophisticated and successful. There's an idea of the First World War as a time of rigid tactics and bloody-minded generals trying the same thing over and over again, but this wasn't the case. As we've seen at Flesquieres during the Battle of Cambrai, the defenders were able to adapt. They'd battled French tanks during the Nivelle offensive, and they used what they'd learned against the British. As well as new and innovative tactics, the Germans had new and innovative technology too. The K round, an armor-tipped bullet fired from an ordinary infantryman's rifle or from a specially designed anti-tank machine gun, was developed in the hope of puncturing the protective shell around the tank. Then there was the T-rifle, or the Mauser 13.1mm anti-tank rifle that appeared in 1918, looking something like an elephant gun and packing a real, armor-piercing punch at close range. The Minenwerfer anti-tank mortar also appeared in 1918 and wreaked havoc as its shells whizzed across the battlefield on a flatter trajectory than a typical mortar. This was an effective weapon, but a shortage of horses toward the end of the war made logistics difficult, and the crews were also vulnerable to machine gun fire. The 3.7cm TAK Rheinmetall specialized anti-tank artillery was designed to be an upgrade for the Minenwerfer with a lower profile than its predecessor. Around 600 were completed in 1918, but it's uncertain how many actually made it to the battlefield. With effective countermeasures in place, it became clear that those early tanks were not invulnerable, impervious leviathans. They might have looked unbeatable, but this wasn't the case. Mechanically unreliable and slow-moving, with dire conditions for the crew inside, exposed to heavy artillery and air attacks, these vehicles could be knocked out of action, and often they were. By the time the war was over in 1918, tanks had been in the line for 2 years. There had already been huge advancements in technology, with the Mark I evolving into the far more sophisticated Mark V. There was certainly a long way to go. The tanks that swept across Europe in the Blitzkrieg of 1939 were light years ahead of these ones, but warfare had changed and it was never going to be the same.